Section 1. The night before everything started. There is a version of the world where Family Guy never happened, where a young man named Seth MacFarlane packed his bags one morning, climbed into a taxi, made it to the airport on time, boarded a plane, and that was that. Where the show about the Griffins and their talking dog and their one-year-old supervillain baby never made it past a college thesis film. Where the cutaway gags and the dinner table arguments and 25 years of television history simply ceased to exist before they had any chance to begin. That world is a whisper away from the one we actually live in. But we will get to that part of the story a little later, because before we can understand what Family Guy was hiding, we have to understand what Family Guy actually was. What it was before it became merchandise and internet memes and Wikipedia arguments about whether the show was ever really good. Before it became the thing people either defend too aggressively or dismiss too easily. We have to go back to the very beginning, to a place that most people never think about when they think about this show. We have to go back to a dorm room. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October, 1973, in a small town called Kent, Connecticut. He was the kind of kid who drew constantly, who filled sketchbooks with characters and scenes and entire imaginary worlds, who was building flip books at the age of 5 after his parents found a book on the subject and handed it to him. By the age of 9, he was writing and illustrating a weekly comic strip for his local newspaper, the Kent Good Times Dispatch. They paid him $5 per installment. The strip was called Walter Crouton. He was 9 years old, getting paid to be funny and already understanding that the right combination of words and pictures could make people feel something they hadn't expected to feel. There is a story from that period that tells you something important about who this kid was. He created a strip where a character was kneeling at the altar during communion, and the punchline was the character asking the priest if he could have fries with that. The local paper printed it. The local priest wrote an angry letter. A small controversy followed. And the 9-year-old boy who drew that strip looked at the whole situation and probably filed it away somewhere useful. The idea that a joke could land in a place that made people uncomfortable, that made them laugh and squirm at the same time, that said something real about something sacred without destroying it entirely. That instinct would show up again, decades later, in nearly every episode of Family Guy. He grew up knowing he wanted to work in animation. At first, the dream was Disney. That was the top of the mountain for anyone who wanted to draw for a living, and MacFarlane had his eyes on it through most of his childhood. But something shifted when he was a teenager and saw The Simpsons for the first time. Here was a cartoon that was doing something entirely different from what Disney was doing. Here was animation on television that had a sharp edge to it, that was aimed at adults without pretending to be for children first. That show changed the shape of what he thought was possible. After high school, he enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the most prestigious art and design colleges in the country. He studied animation, he got better, he worked harder than most people around him, and the evidence for this is in what he produced while he was still a student. His senior thesis film was called The Life of Larry, and it featured a heavyset, not particularly bright middle-aged man named Larry and his extraordinarily intelligent talking dog named Steve. Larry had a wife. They lived a fairly ordinary, slightly absurd domestic life, and the comedy came from the contrast between Larry's limited understanding of the world around him and Steve's entirely too sophisticated awareness of everything. If you watch The Life of Larry today, the DNA is impossible to miss. Larry has a voice and a body and a set of mannerisms that will feel immediately familiar to anyone who grew up watching Family Guy. Steve the dog is dry and witty and clearly the smartest person in any room he enters. The whole thing plays like a sketch for something larger that was quietly forming inside MacFarlane's imagination while he was still writing papers and attending critiques and probably eating questionable dining hall food. A professor saw the film and submitted it to Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio that had given the world the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo and 100 other things that shaped what cartoons meant to an entire generation of American children. Hanna-Barbera hired MacFarlane while he was still finishing his degree. He graduated in 1995, moved to Los Angeles, and started doing what young animation professionals do when they get their first real job at a real studio. He wrote for shows. He worked on Dexter's Laboratory and Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken, 3 shows that occupied very different corners of the cartoon landscape, but each of which taught him something about timing and rhythm and the specific mechanics of making people laugh through images and motion. During that time, he made a follow-up to The Life of Larry. He called it Larry and Steve. It was broadcast in 1997 as part of Cartoon Network's world premiere Toon Showcase, a program that had been giving short film opportunities to young animators. The characters were the same, the dynamic was the same, but something had sharpened. The jokes landed more cleanly. The relationship between the human and the dog had more weight to it, more warmth underneath the wit. If the life of Larry was a sketch, Larry and Steve was a rough draft. And rough drafts, when they're good enough, find their way to people who can make them into something more. Executives at Fox saw the Larry shorts. They called MacFarlane. They asked him if he wanted to build a full television series around those characters. He said yes. They gave him $50,000 to produce a 15-minute pilot. A budget like that sounds like a reasonable starting point, but for an animated production, it is almost nothing. 48 minutes of airtime at a professional animation studio costs millions of dollars. 15 minutes for $50,000 meant that MacFarlane was essentially doing a significant portion of the work himself, drawing and writing and voice acting and directing from his apartment, sleeping very little, completing one of the strangest solo artistic marathons in the history of American television. He finished it. He pitched it to Fox on the 15th of May, 1998. The full 15-minute demo remained largely unknown for years, with only the first 7 minutes making it onto DVD bonus features. The complete version didn't surface publicly until 2025, when it was uploaded to the internet and people finally got to see exactly what MacFarlane had created in that cramped, coffee-fueled period of his life. The details had changed from the Larry shorts. Larry was now Peter, a working-class Irish-American family man in Rhode Island. Steve was now Brian, still white, still witty, still fundamentally the only adult in the room. The wife was still Lois. There were now 3 children, including a baby who in the very first scene was quietly assembling a mind control device. Fox liked what they saw. They greenlit the series. They ordered it to air following Super Bowl 33 on the 31st of January 1999. MacFarlane was 24 years old. He became the youngest showrunner in the history of American network television, a record that he held for years. 22 million people watched that first episode, a number that was partially inflated by the Super Bowl lead-in, but that was also genuinely a stunning debut for any new show, let alone a cartoon about a mildly ridiculous family in a fictional Rhode Island town. The world that MacFarlane built in those first episodes was one that he had been building for years before anyone knew his name. It came from real observations about real people. It came from a childhood in New England surrounded by the specific kinds of men and women who would eventually become the Griffins and their neighbors. It came from sketchbooks and thesis films and late nights at a studio desk and a security guard at the Rhode Island School of Design, whose name was Paul Timmons, a broad-voiced, unfiltered, glasses-wearing man who had, almost certainly without knowing it, provided the blueprint for one of the most recognizable fictional characters in the history of television. But the show that aired on the 31st of January 1999 was not simply the product of a gifted young man's professional ambition. It was the product of something deeper. It was a story that MacFarlane had been trying to tell for most of his life, dressed up in silly costumes and presented to the largest possible audience on the biggest possible night. And to understand what that story actually was, you have to look much more carefully at the people he put at the center of it. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment to do that. Section 2: The Secret Architecture of the Griffins. Every character in Family Guy was built on a real thing. That sounds obvious. Writers draw from life, creators borrow from experience. Every character on every show has some kernel of observable reality at its center. But with Family Guy, the borrowing goes deeper than it usually does, and the intentions behind the characters reveal a set of ideas that the show never announced openly, never put in a press release, never discussed in the kind of earnest, serious terms that would have made people dismiss it as pretentious. The ideas were hidden inside the jokes. The message was tucked into the absurdity, and once you see what was being said, you cannot unsee it. Peter Griffin did not spring from MacFarlane's imagination fully formed. He grew from an earlier character, Larry, who grew from a real man, Paul Timmons, who worked as the director of public safety at the Rhode Island School of Design, who wore glasses and a white button-down shirt and had a dense Rhode Island accent and, according to MacFarlane, absolutely zero internal editing mechanism. Whatever thought appeared in Paul Timmons's head came directly out of his mouth before he'd had any opportunity to evaluate it, shape it, or decide whether it was the kind of thing that should be said out loud in front of other people. MacFarlane has talked about this in multiple interviews. He said he knew 1,000 people like that growing up in New England. Big, loud, opinionated Irish Catholic men who were bursting at the seams with personality, who had strong feelings about everything and no particular interest in filtering those feelings before sharing them with everyone in earshot. The men his father knew. The men he saw at bars and backyard parties and church parking lots. Working-class New Englanders with their specific rhythms and references, and their particular way of moving through the world with complete confidence in their own perspective, regardless of whether that perspective had any relationship to reality. Peter Griffin is a portrait of that type, but he is also something more specific than a type, and this is the part that gets missed in most conversations about the show. Peter is a satirical portrait of a man out of time. The theme song tells you this directly, in a way that most people hear without actually listening to. The opening sequence ends with Peter at the piano asking Lois where those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely have gone. It is not a nostalgic question. It is a satirical one. It is MacFarlane asking, through Peter's mouth, what exactly it is that we think we lost, and whether we ever had it in the first place. Peter's entire existence is built around a man who has decided that some version of the past was better than the present, and who lacks the intellectual equipment to examine that assumption. Lois, who was born Lois Pewterschmidt, comes from serious money. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a billionaire industrialist who has never respected Peter and never will, who tried to pay Peter $1 million to walk away from the marriage before it happened, who views his son-in-law with a contempt that he barely makes any effort to conceal. Lois chose to leave that world. She chose the working-class man over the wealthy suitors her background would have made available. She lives on Spooner Street in a house that is modest even by the standards of Quahog, raising 3 children and a talking dog while her father sits in a mansion and shakes his head. The class dimension of this relationship is the hidden story running beneath every episode involving the Pewterschmidts. It is a version of a story that runs through all of American culture. The woman who could have married rich, who chose love instead, who has never quite been forgiven for it by the people she came from, and who has never quite escaped the gravitational pull of who she used to be. Lois is not simply Peter's sensible wife. She is a woman navigating 2 worlds simultaneously. She is the person who understands everything Peter doesn't and chooses to stay anyway, which raises a question the show was always asking quietly without ever answering directly. Why does she stay? What is the actual thing she sees in him that makes all of this worth it? And then there is Brian, who is probably the most deliberately constructed character in the entire show, and whose construction reveals more about Seth MacFarlane's intentions than anything else on the screen. Brian Griffin is voiced in Seth MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, not a character voice, his actual voice, the one he uses when he is talking to interviewers and giving speeches at Harvard and accepting awards. This is not an accident. MacFarlane has confirmed that Brian is in significant ways a version of himself. A dog who drinks too much, who aspires to be a serious writer, who fancies himself an intellectual in a household full of people who don't entirely appreciate what that means, who went to a prestigious university, who has read widely and thought carefully, and still cannot quite manage to build the life he believes he deserves. Brian is the portrait of the artist as a frustrated man. He is what happens when ambition and intelligence coexist with self-destructiveness and an inability to finish anything. The detail that Brian attended Brown University is quietly significant. Brown is in Providence, Rhode Island. The Rhode Island School of Design, where MacFarlane went to college, shares a campus with Brown. They are neighbors. The kinds of students who move between those 2 institutions, the art school kids and the Ivy League kids, overlapping at coffee shops and parties, observing each other from across a gentle social divide, are exactly the kind of people who end up producing a character like Brian Griffin, educated enough to know what good writing looks like, struggling enough with the actual process of producing it that the gap between aspiration and execution becomes its own kind of comedy. Brian's addiction to alcohol is played for laughs throughout the show, and it is funny in the way that most things involving Brian are funny, which is to say that the humor is coded over something a little uncomfortable. He has genuine withdrawal symptoms in certain episodes. He cannot stop drinking even when he tries. His alcoholism is presented as a character trait rather than a crisis, which is itself a kind of commentary on how middle-class society tends to treat the drinking habits of educated people. Brian's problem is aestheticized. He drinks dry martinis at a piano bar, not cheap beer from a can. The sophistication of his poison is part of what makes it acceptable, which is exactly how a certain kind of person in the real world gets away with something that would be recognized as a serious problem in someone without his vocabulary. McFarlane has said in interviews that Brian's failed writing career is a reference to Snoopy from Peanuts, another famous dog who typed away at an unfinished novel atop his doghouse without ever completing it. There is something deeply funny and deeply melancholy about that parallel. Snoopy typing in the rain, convinced he is writing something important. Brian staring at a manuscript he has been working on for years, a book whose plot is, as Stewie mercilessly points out at one point, essentially a ripoff of the Iron Eagle films. The gap between the writer's sense of themselves and the actual quality of their work is one of the oldest comedies in literary history, and McFarlane put it at the center of a character who is simultaneously his alter ego and one of the show's most reliable sources of pathos. Stewie was built on Rex Harrison, specifically on Rex Harrison's performance as Henry Higgins in the 1964 film My Fair Lady, a musical about a phonetics professor who attempts to transform a working-class girl into someone who can pass as upper class by changing the way she speaks. The voice McFarlane uses for Stewie is modeled on Harrison's particular kind of English theatrical authority, the clipped vowels and the elongated consonants, and the delivery that sounds simultaneously amused by and contemptuous of everything around it. McFarlane has described the character as an evil Rex Harrison, which is exactly right. Stewie is what happens when you take the theatrical pomposity of a certain kind of English performance tradition and attach it to the desires and frustrations of a one-year-old. The specific object of Stewie's murderous intent in the early seasons, his mother Lois, is the key to understanding what the character was originally designed to say. Stewie refers to the womb from which he emerged as his ovarian Bastille. The Bastille was the prison that French revolutionaries stormed at the beginning of the French Revolution, the symbol of an oppressive system that needed to be destroyed. An infant calling his mother's womb a prison and his birth a jailbreak is a very strange and specific idea, but it is also a deeply coherent one. McFarlane has said that Stewie was created to represent the general helplessness of an infant, to embody what it might look like if you took all the frustration and powerlessness of being a baby, all the dependency and indignity of the earliest years of human existence, and gave it the intellectual vocabulary to process and articulate those feelings. The evil genius is not really evil. He is an infant, who is furious about being an infant. The murderous impulse toward Lois is not really murderous. It is the exaggerated version of the psychic separation that all children must eventually perform from their parents in order to become individuals. Chris, the middle child, carries the least of the show's hidden freight, and that is itself a kind of commentary. He is his father's son in almost every visible way, large and not particularly bright, and operating almost entirely on instinct. The voice Seth Green used for him, based on a deeply strange riff on the killer Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, filtered through the mouth of an 11-year-old, is absurd enough that the character functions primarily as a deliverer of unexpected non-sequiturs, rather than as a vehicle for deeper ideas. But even Chris carries a quiet truth. He is what Peter was before time, and circumstances compressed him into the specific shape he now occupies. He is Peter in an earlier stage. He has his father's appetites and his father's limitations, and watching him move through the world is watching a particular kind of American man in the process of being assembled. And Meg. We will spend a great deal of time with Meg in this story, but for now, what matters is that she was designed to be ordinary. In a family populated by a supervillain baby, a talking intellectual dog, an obese working-class satirical portrait, and a woman navigating between two class worlds, Meg was simply a teenage girl. That was the original design. Her ordinariness in the context of everyone else's extravagance was meant to be the joke, but it was also meant to be the heart. She was the audience's entry point into a household of extremes. She was the person the viewers were supposed to recognize. What happened to her over the years is one of the most disturbing transformations in the history of television, and we will get to all of it. But it started here, with a design that was, in its original form, respectful, even affectionate. The Griffin family was built on real people, real observations, real ideas about class and ambition, and the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are. Every character had a layer beneath the punchline. Every relationship had a subtext underneath the comedy. And the man who built it knew exactly what he was doing. Even if he never announced it, even if the show itself would spend the next 2.5 decades making it increasingly difficult to see. Section 3. The show that almost never aired. The story of how Family Guy made it onto television is also the story of how it almost didn't, multiple times, in ways that reveal something important about how the television industry actually works and about the fragile, contingent nature of any creative work that survives long enough to matter. The first episode aired on the 31st of January 1999. 22 million people watched it. By any reasonable measure, that was a success. But the number was misleading, because it was a Super Bowl number. The Super Bowl is the single biggest television event in the American calendar, and anything that airs immediately after it benefits from a massive inherited audience that would not otherwise be watching. Fox understood this, which is why they had placed Family Guy in that slot in the first place. They were using the Super Bowl to introduce the show to as many people as possible in a single evening. The gamble was that enough of those 22 million viewers would like what they saw and come back for the second episode. The problem was what happened next. Fox was not, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a network that treated its new animated shows with particular care. The network had a history of moving shows around the schedule without much notice, placing them opposite established hits on competing networks without much strategic thought, and then being surprised when the ratings dropped. Family Guy became the target of all of this scheduling chaos in a way that seems almost comically aggressive in retrospect. After the premiere, Fox moved the show to a Thursday night slot. That placed it directly opposite Frasier on NBC, which was at that point one of the most popular and critically lauded comedies on American television. Frasier averaged around 20 million viewers a week. Family Guy, stripped of its Super Bowl inheritance and placed against a deeply entrenched competitor, could not hold its own. The ratings dropped. Fox moved the show again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it found itself competing with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Millionaire was, in 1999 and 2000, a national obsession. Regis Philbin asking people if they wanted to phone a friend had the entire country riveted in a way that is difficult to fully explain to anyone who did not experience it in real time. Family Guy, now on Tuesday nights against the most talked-about show in America, dropped further. Fox kept moving it. Different days, different times, different competition. The show never had a stable home. It never had the chance to build the kind of consistent, habitual viewership that allows a show to establish itself in the culture. People who liked it had to actively seek it out each week to figure out what night it was on and whether it was new or a repeat. That is a significant ask for a show that was not yet an institution, that was not yet the kind of thing people organized their evenings around. By the end of the second season, Fox canceled the show. Then they brought it back for a third season. Then, at the end of that third season, with ratings that had continued to decline because Fox kept scheduling it against Friends and Survivor and every other dominant show of the era, they canceled it again. The third season ended in June of 2002. An episode called North by North Quahog had already been produced but went unaired on Fox. The writers left. The voice cast moved on to other projects. Seth MacFarlane, 28 years old, had watched his creation get assembled, disassembled, reassembled, and disassembled again by a network that had never quite figured out what to do with it. There was a specific moment during this period that MacFarlane has spoken about, a moment that illustrates the particular helplessness of a creator watching their work get managed by people who do not fully understand it. Fox had given the show the green light. Fox had put it on the air. Fox had then proceeded to shuffle it around the schedule so repeatedly and so carelessly that it never had a chance to find its audience. And then Fox had canceled it and cited the low ratings as the reason, ratings that their own scheduling choices had largely produced. The irony of this did not escape anyone involved. But here is the part that the standard telling of this story usually glosses over too quickly. The show was not simply canceled and then miraculously revived, Between those two events was a period of approximately 3 years, during which something genuinely unusual happened, something that had not happened in television before. The show found its audience in the dark. Cartoon Network, operating through its adult programming block called Adult Swim, bought the rights to air Family Guy reruns. They bought these rights cheaply, reportedly for almost nothing, because nobody thought the show had much residual value. A canceled cartoon that had struggled in prime time was not generally considered a hot property. The price reflected that assessment. Adult Swim began airing Family Guy reruns on the 20th of April 2003. Within a very short period of time, the show became the highest-rated program on the entire block. It dominated its time slot. It boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. This was not a modest improvement. This was a show that had been written off as a failure, transforming an entire cable programming block into a success story. The audience that Fox had spent 3 years failing to locate, the audience that had been there the whole time, had found its way to the show through a completely different channel, in the middle of the night, at a time when the network that had created it had given up on it entirely. At the same time, the DVD releases for the first and second seasons landed in stores. The complete first season sold more than 2.5 million copies, becoming the second best-selling television DVD of the year, right behind the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. People who had found the show on Adult Swim were buying the DVDs. People who had bought the DVDs were watching it on Adult Swim. The two pipelines were feeding each other, building something that the television industry did not have a precise vocabulary for yet. A cult phenomenon that had grown entirely outside the system that had created it, powered by the kind of word-of-mouth enthusiasm that studios spend enormous amounts of money trying to manufacture and almost never successfully produce on command. Fox watched all of this and came to the conclusion that they had made a mistake. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice called MacFarlane in and told him they wanted to sneak the show back into production. He has quoted that phrase in multiple interviews, "sneak it back," as if the show were a secret, as if its existence were something to be managed carefully rather than celebrated. There is something quietly revealing about that phrasing, about the way the network framed its own reversal. They were not announcing that they had been wrong and were correcting the error. They were describing the revival as a covert operation, a quiet adjustment to the schedule rather than a public acknowledgement that something valuable had been killed and that they were fortunate to have the opportunity to undo the damage. The fourth season premiered on the 1st of May 2005. Fox placed it on Sunday nights as part of what they were calling Animation Domination, a block that also featured The Simpsons and King of the Hill, and a new MacFarlane show called American Dad that was premiering the same year. 11.85 million people watched the Season 4 premiere. The audience that had grown in the dark, in the reruns and the DVD player viewings at 2 in the morning, was still there. It had gotten bigger. It had gotten louder. It had gotten more passionate in the way that audiences get when they feel like they have been let in on something that not everyone knows about yet. The show was back. But the question that nobody was asking yet, the question that would become more and more important as the years went by, was whether the show that came back was the same show that had left, whether 3 years of canceled production and scattered writing staff, and the specific kind of creative dislocation that comes from having your work interrupted and then resumed under entirely different circumstances, had changed. Something fundamental about what the show was and what it was trying to say. The answer, looking back from where we stand now, is complicated, and it starts in a way that almost no discussion of Family Guy's second chapter ever acknowledges. Section 4. The Hangover That Changed Television. On the morning of the 10th of September, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was in Providence, Rhode Island. He was there to give a lecture at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, where he had studied animation a decade earlier, where he had made the short film that started everything, where he had first overheard the voice that became Peter Griffin. He gave the lecture. He went out afterward with some of the faculty. He had a few drinks. He stayed out later than he should have. He was supposed to be on American Airlines Flight 11 the next morning, a flight departing Boston for Los Angeles at 7:45 in the morning. He woke up late. There were 2 things working against him that morning, as he has explained in multiple interviews over the years. One was the hangover from the night before. The other was a mistake his travel agent had made, listing the flight's departure time as 8:15 when it actually left at 7:45. The combination of those two errors, the late night and the wrong time on the itinerary, meant that he arrived at Logan Airport in Boston after the gate had already closed. The woman at the counter told him he was too late. She said they had just closed the gate and he could not board. He went to the airport lounge. He sat down. He fell asleep. He woke up 45 minutes later to commotion around him. People were standing up, moving toward televisions mounted on the walls, talking in the low, urgent voices that people use when something large and terrible is happening. The first plane had already hit. McFarlane was told what flight it was, and the information settled over him slowly, and then all at once. American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 in the morning. All 92 people on board were killed, along with more than 1,000 people in the building. McFarlane had missed the flight by 10 minutes. He has spoken about this experience with a notable lack of drama. He does not frame it as a miracle. He does not speak of it in the language of fate or destiny or divine intervention. He says, plainly, that coincidences happen, that he misses flights for stupid reasons all the time, that he is not a fate person, that the experience was rattling for a few weeks, obviously, and then he continued living because that is what people do when something nearly happens to them. The near miss recedes. The life that was nearly not there goes on being a life. But here is what the near miss means for our story. In the months following the 11th of September 2001, American comedy went through a period of genuine uncertainty about what it was allowed to do and say. The attacks had created a cultural atmosphere in which humor felt, at least briefly, inappropriate. Jokes about violence and death and the fragility of institutions suddenly occupied a different register. Shows that had operated with a kind of breezy confidence about their right to say anything they wanted found themselves navigating much more carefully. Family Guy, which had always pushed into uncomfortable territory with what felt like effortless ease, was already canceled by the time September 11 happened. But the show's relationship with the tragedy would continue in ways that were both strange and revealing. In the Season 2 episode Road to Rhode Island, which aired in the year 2000, there was a joke involving Osama bin Laden in an airport. It was removed from the original DVD release after September 11. It is a small detail, but it is the kind of detail that says something about how closely the show had always been watching the world, how deeply its humor was embedded in the specific texture of the cultural moment in which it was produced. And then, in 2011, Family Guy aired an episode called Back to the Pilot. In this episode, Brian and Stewie use Stewie's time machine to travel back to the events of the very first episode in 1999. While they are there, Brian, knowing what is going to happen, seriously considers preventing September 11 from occurring. He thinks about warning people. He thinks about changing history. And what the episode ultimately explores is the impossibility of that kind of intervention, the way that trying to fix one catastrophic thing creates a cascade of other consequences that are, in some ways, even worse. The episode ends with the two of them choosing to allow September 11 to happen, which sounds horrifying when you write it out like that, but which functions in the context of the episode as a meditation on the limits of human agency, on the way that history resists being unmade. Seth MacFarlane, who had missed that flight by 10 minutes, wrote an episode about choosing not to go back and stop it. Think about what that means. Think about the specific emotional weight of a man who was supposed to be on one of those planes, writing a story in which a time traveler has the chance to prevent the attack and decides, after long deliberation, not to do so. It is not a nihilistic conclusion. It is something more complicated and more honest than nihilism. It is an acknowledgement that the events of that morning have become part of what exists, part of what the present is built on, and that the fantasy of undoing them, however natural, comes at costs that are impossible to calculate. MacFarlane does not identify as a fate person. He does not believe he was saved for a reason. But the art he made in the aftermath of the near miss carries the weight of it anyway, the show that nearly lost its creator before it ever found its audience. The comedy about a dysfunctional family that was always also a meditation, however buried under cutaway gags and chicken fights, on the strangeness of survival. There is something else in this story that gets lost in the usual retelling. The 9/11 attacks happened in September 2001. Family Guy had been canceled for the second time in May 2002. The show spent the period from 2002 to 2005 in a kind of suspended animation, existing in reruns and on DVD, growing an audience without producing new content. McFarlane spent those 3 years working on other things, staying connected to the world of animation, processing whatever he needed to process after his experience at that airport lounge. When he came back to produce the fourth season in 2005, he came back as a different person than the 24-year-old who had produced the first season in 1999. He had survived something. He had watched his show get canceled, find its audience, and get renewed. He had watched the world transform in ways that nobody had anticipated. He had accumulated 3 more years of experience and perspective, and whatever it is that living through things adds to a person's understanding of what matters. The fourth season shows the evidence of all of this, in ways both good and difficult. The good parts are the episodes that feel like they were made by someone who had genuinely thought hard about what the show was capable of, what stories it could tell, what kind of emotional range was available to these characters and this world if the writers were willing to reach for it. The difficult parts are the ways in which something had shifted in the room, in the writing, in the texture of the humor, that would take years to fully understand. Section 5. The Resurrection Nobody Saw Coming. Let us spend some time in the dark with the show that should have been dead. Because the period between 2002 and 2005, the years when Family Guy was canceled and existed only in syndication and on home video, is one of the most genuinely strange chapters in television history. It is the chapter in which the actual audience for the show revealed themselves, the people who had been there all along, who had been unable to find the show on its original run because Fox kept moving it around the schedule like a piece of furniture that nobody could find a good place for. Adult Swim began airing the reruns in April of 2003. The block ran from approximately 11 at night until 5 or 6 in the morning. It was the hour of the night when the regular television audience had gone to bed, when the people still watching were a self-selected group with specific tastes and a tolerance for the kind of humor that mainstream primetime television generally avoided. These were not the 22 million people who had watched the Super Bowl premiere. These were the people who stayed up late, who found things in the margins that the mainstream had decided were not worth preserving. And they loved it. The ratings were not merely good, they were spectacular. Family Guy became the top-rated program on the block, pulling in numbers that surprised everyone who had written it off as a failed experiment. The show that Fox had canceled because it could not find an audience had found one the moment it was placed in a context that matched it. The late-night cable audience that watched Adult Swim was exactly the audience that the show's sensibility had been built for. The combination of sharp writing, deep pop culture references, absurdist humor, and willingness to go to uncomfortable places was perfectly calibrated for viewers who had grown up with The Simpsons and Beavis and Butthead and a dozen other things that had pushed the boundaries of what comedy on television was allowed to be. At the same time, the DVD releases arrived. The complete first season sold more than 2.2 million copies, making it the second best-selling television DVD of 2003. The DVD phenomenon was significant for a reason that goes beyond the sales numbers. People who buy the DVD of a television show are making a different kind of commitment than people who simply watch it on television. They are saying that this thing is worth preserving. They are saying that they want to be able to return to it, to watch specific episodes again, to share it with friends who missed it the first time. The purchase of a DVD is an act of fandom in a way that watching a rerun is not. Family Guy on DVD reached people who had not seen it on Fox. It reached college students who had been too young for the original run. It reached the kind of people who stayed up watching Adult Swim and then went looking for more. The two pipelines fed each other in a way that the executives at Fox watched from a distance with growing bewilderment. They had sold the rights to this show for almost nothing because they did not believe it had significant residual value. They were discovering that they had been deeply wrong. The numbers were undeniable. Adult Swim was using Family Guy as its primary driver. DVD sales were setting records. A show that had been canceled twice was generating more cultural conversation and more financial value in death than it had managed to produce in life. Fox began the conversation about bringing it back. McFarlane, speaking about this period later, said that Fox called him in and told him they wanted to sneak the show back into production. He has quoted that phrase multiple times in interviews, always with a certain tone that suggests he found it simultaneously flattering and slightly absurd. The network that had canceled his show twice wanted to quietly resurrect it, to bring it back without making too much noise about the fact that they had been wrong to kill it. Season 4 premiered in May of 2005. 11.85 million viewers, an enormous number for a show returning from the dead. The audience that had grown in the dark came back out into the open. It was the largest viewership for a new episode since the first season, demonstrating conclusively that the 3 years of cancellation had not killed the fanbase but had instead intensified it, had created the kind of loyal, passionate audience that shows usually only develop through consistent exposure over many years. Family Guy had done it through absence. The return was a genuine event in popular culture, and it was received as one. Critics noted the show's revival with the mix of enthusiasm and cautious uncertainty that greets anything that has come back from somewhere it was not supposed to come back from. The enthusiasm was real and warranted. The caution was also real, and, looking back, somewhat prophetic. Because the show that came back in 2005 was the same show in the ways that mattered most to the people who were excited about its return. It had the same characters, it had the same setting, it had the same voice cast, the same basic structure, the same willingness to go places that other animated comedies avoided. But it was also different, in ways that were initially subtle enough to be easy to miss, ways that would become more apparent as the seasons accumulated, as the writing staff turned over, as MacFarlane became less involved in the day-to-day creative decisions. The most immediate difference was visible. The animation had changed. The original seasons had been produced by studios that gave the show a slightly loose, organic quality, a handmade feel that matched the rough edges of the humor. The revival had cleaner lines, smoother movements, a more polished look that was technically better in some ways but felt slightly less alive. Comedy is deeply tied to physicality, to the way a face moves and a body responds, and animation comedy is no different. The way a character's expression shifts when a joke lands, the specific way a body falls or stumbles or reacts to an unexpected event, these things determine whether a moment is funny or merely competent. The revival's animation was more competent than what had come before. It was also, in some hard-to-quantify way, a little less funny. But there was something even more significant happening beneath the surface of the animation change. The 3 years of canceled production had scattered the writing staff. The people who had built the first 3 seasons, who had sat in a room with MacFarlane and collectively figured out what the show was and what it wanted to say and how to say it, had moved on to other jobs during the hiatus. Some came back, others did not. New writers had been hired, talented people with their own sensibilities and their own ideas about what made the show funny. The blend was different. The voice in the room was different, even if the voices coming out of the speakers were the same. MacFarlane has been candid about this in interviews. He acknowledged that one of the costs of the show's repeated cancellations and revivals was the constant need to restaff the writing room. Writers do not wait. When a show is canceled, they find other work, because the alternative is not eating. When the show came back, it came back with a new configuration of people, and that new configuration brought things to the show that the original configuration would not have brought. Some of those things were good, some were not. But before any of that had time to fully emerge, before the seasons started to accumulate and the changes started to compound, there was still the matter of what the show itself was hiding. The deeper story underneath the stories. The intentions behind the characters that the audience had been responding to without necessarily being able to name what they were responding to. That story had been there from the beginning, and the show's return from the dead gave it new opportunities to tell it. Section 6. What Stewie was really saying. Stuart Gilligan Griffin is 1 year old. He has been 1 year old for a very long time. He was 1 year old when the show premiered in January of 1999. He reached his first birthday in the season 1 episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang, celebrated with a party that was, from Stewie's perspective, an excellent opportunity to launch his next scheme for world domination. He stayed 1 year old for every subsequent season. He remained 1 year old in a body that was never going to grow while the world around him changed, and the show aged, and the culture moved on, and everything else transformed except for the age printed on his birthday cake. There is something philosophically interesting about a character who is frozen in time in that particular way. Most animated shows freeze their characters in a kind of perpetual present, in which the story resets at the end of each episode and nobody meaningfully ages or learns or carries the consequences of what happened the week before. Family Guy does this too, in the way that all shows of its type do. But Stewie's specific frozen age, 1-year-old, is loaded with implications that the show was always half exploring and half ignoring. Seth MacFarlane has said, in one of the most useful things he has said about any of his characters, that Stewie was created to represent the general helplessness of an infant through the eyes of an adult. That sentence is the key to everything about the original version of the character. It is not just a funny premise. It is an extremely specific psychological insight. What would it be like, MacFarlane was asking, to experience the condition of infancy while possessing an adult's cognitive and emotional complexity? What would it be like to be completely dependent on other people for every physical need, unable to communicate fully with the people around you, trapped in a body that cannot yet do what you want it to do, surrounded by a world that is not designed for you and that mostly ignores whatever you are trying to express, and to understand all of this with the full awareness and articulacy of a mature mind? The answer, in Stewie's case, is that it would feel like a prison. It would feel like a kind of tyranny. The person responsible for your continued physical existence, the person who feeds you and bathes you and holds you and meets your needs before you can express them, would be simultaneously the most important person in your world and the most immediate symbol of your captivity. You would be completely dependent on her and completely at her mercy, which means that your fantasies of freedom would inevitably take the shape of fantasies about her destruction. The word Stewie uses for his mother's womb is, again, the ovarian Bastille. The Bastille was the fortress in Paris that housed political prisoners, and that became the first target of the French Revolution, precisely because it stood for the arbitrary power of the state over the individual. When Stewie describes his birth as escaping the Bastille, he is using the language of political liberation to describe what is, in biological terms, simply being born. He is treating his own mother as a symbol of unjust authority. And this is, MacFarlane seems to be suggesting, not entirely an exaggeration of the infant's actual psychological situation, which is to say that the infant genuinely is, to a greater degree than we usually acknowledge, a prisoner of the body that produced it and the person responsible for maintaining it. The British accent complicates this further. Stewie does not sound like his family. His parents are working-class Americans, specifically working-class New Englanders, with the flat vowels and dropped R's of that regional dialect. His siblings are young Americans. The dog speaks in MacFarlane's natural California-inflected voice. And then there is Stewie, who sounds like he belongs in a Noel Coward play, who speaks with the theatrical authority of a mid-century English stage actor, who uses vocabulary that would be unusual in a distinguished adult professor, let alone a 1-year-old. The accent has never been explained within the show. It is simply there. It is one of the show's unresolved mysteries, deliberately maintained, never resolved. MacFarlane has suggested in interviews that the idea was that a baby, having no frame of reference for what accents sound like, or what they mean socially, would simply absorb whatever vocal patterns sounded most interesting or authoritative or powerful to them, and that a baby who was already inclined toward world domination might find that the sounds associated with English theatrical authority felt most congruent with his self-image. But there is another reading available, one that the show never offers directly, but that is consistent with everything else Stewie represents. The British accent in an American household is a mark of otherness. It signals that this person does not quite belong to the world they inhabit. They come from somewhere else, or they think they come from somewhere else, or they aspire to a different kind of existence than the one they have been placed in. The accent is Stewie's declaration that he is not fully part of this family. He arrived here, but he was not made here. He has ambitions and vocabularies and ways of being in the world that have nothing to do with the working-class Rhode Island home he shares with the rest of the Griffins. In the very first episode, the first words Stewie says on screen are spoken while he is assembling a mind control device at the breakfast table. He says, "Excellent. The mind control device is nearing completion." Lois reaches over and takes the device, thinking it is a toy. Stewie says, "Darn you, vile woman. You've impeded my work since the day I escaped your wretched womb." Those are the first words he speaks. A complaint about his mother, a description of his birth as an escape, a declaration that the only barrier between him and his goals is the woman who produced him. It is not a random selection of dialogue. It is a precise statement of the character's fundamental orientation. He arrived here against his will, or at least without being consulted, and he has been working ever since to reassert the autonomy that the accident of birth denied him. The schemes for world domination function within this framework as something more than cartoon villainy. They are expressions of a desire for complete control, for the opposite of helplessness, for a state in which no one can take a mind control device out of your hands because you have no hands small enough to be taken seriously. The laser guns and time machines and weather control devices that populated Stewie's bedroom in the early seasons were the external projections of an internal condition. They were the tools a mind would build if the primary experience of that mind was complete powerlessness in a body that everyone else found adorable. There was a moment in the show's history, in the 6th season two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, when the original version of this character was given what felt like a proper conclusion. Stewie finally, in what turns out to be a simulation running on his computer, achieves what he has been working toward since the first episode. He kills Lois, he takes over the world. He sits in a position of absolute authority and looks around at the civilization he has conquered and delivers the speeches he has been rehearsing in his bedroom for years. And it feels, for 2 episodes, like everything has been earned. Like the show has followed its own internal logic all the way to its conclusion. And then the twist? It was a simulation. None of it happened. Everything resets. MacFarlane and the writing team used this moment as the unofficial goodbye to the original Stewie, and they were honest about it. They felt the evil baby premise had gone as far as it could go. They believed the jokes about world domination had been exhausted. They wanted to take the character somewhere new. The direction they chose, leaning into his friendship with Brian, exploring his personal identity, making him softer and more emotionally available, produced some of the show's best episodes. The Road to specials, which sent Brian and Stewie on adventures through time and space and alternate dimensions, became some of the most beloved episodes in the show's entire run. The episode Brian and Stewie, in which the two characters get locked in a bank vault and spend 22 minutes having one of the most emotionally raw conversations in the show's history, is genuinely extraordinary television. But something was lost, something that had been one of a kind. The baby who wanted to murder his mother and conquer the world was not a joke that had exhausted itself. It was a premise that the writers had grown tired of, which is a completely different thing. The idea that an infant experiences its dependency as captivity, that the helplessness of early childhood contains genuine frustration and genuine fury that adults choose not to see, was not an idea that had been fully explored. It had been introduced, played with, and then retired in favor of something easier to work with. The newer, softer Stewie is a good character. He is funny and occasionally touching and capable of the kind of emotional honesty that the original version would never have allowed. But he is not a unique character. He is a version of something that exists in many places. The original Stewie was genuinely unlike anything else in animation. There was only one evil genius baby, and the writers decided, fairly early in the show's history, that they had found the limit of what they could do with him. Looking back with the knowledge that Family Guy would go on to produce many more seasons with the gentler version of Stewie than it ever produced with the dangerous one, the decision to retire him feels premature. The original version of the character had decades more potential. The premise was not exhausted. It was only the people in the room who were. Section 7. Brian Griffin and the Lie of the Intellectual. There is a particular kind of person who appears in every college town, in every literary circle, in every gathering of people who consider themselves to be operating at a higher cultural register than the surrounding society. They have read widely, or they say they have. They have strong opinions about important things. They order the right drinks and know the right names, and can hold a conversation about almost anything for approximately 15 minutes before the depth of the knowledge runs out. They are, in the language that gets used for them, pretentious. They are in love with the idea of themselves as serious people. Brian Griffin is that person. In the early seasons, he is that person in the most generous possible interpretation. He is the genuine article, or close to it. He has actually read the books. He actually appreciates the jazz. His intelligence is real, if somewhat self-regarding. His relationship with Peter is based on a genuine affection, on a friendship between two very different people who somehow found in each other something that each of them needed. Brian needs Peter because Peter gives him an audience that does not judge him by the standards he applies to himself. Peter needs Brian because Brian is the only person in his life who takes the trouble to think through the consequences of things before they happen. The relationship was built on a specific dynamic from the very first episode, and it is worth spending some time with that dynamic because it explains why the later changes to Brian's character felt like such a betrayal to so many viewers. In the early seasons, Brian was the character the audience was meant to identify with. He was the one who saw the situation clearly, who understood what was happening, who reacted to the Griffin household's chaos with the dry resignation of a person who is too smart to be surprised, but too fond of the people around him to leave. He was the audience's surrogate in a family of extremes. His failures were part of this. The novel he had been working on for years, Faster Than the Speed of Love, which Stewie eventually reads and identifies as essentially a ripoff of the Iron Eagle films, is the most important detail in Brian's early characterization. The aspiration to be a serious writer. The years of work. The finished product that turns out to be neither original nor particularly good. This is not a joke at Brian's expense. It is the most human thing about him. The gap between the writer we imagine ourselves to be and the writer the work reveals us to actually be is one of the most universal experiences available to anyone who has ever tried to make something. Brian's novel is a tragedy in miniature, and the show's willingness to make it genuinely bad rather than secretly brilliant is one of the most honest choices it made about this character. His alcoholism is similarly honest in the early seasons. He drinks too much. He knows it. The people around him know it. The show treats it as a real characteristic rather than simply a comedic prop, which means that it carries weight in scenes where the humor recedes and the character's actual situation becomes visible. There is an early episode called Brian Portrait of a Dog, in which Brian feels unappreciated and leaves the family to pursue life as a show dog, a career for which he is entirely unsuited but which represents, in his mind, a chance for the kind of recognition he does not receive at home. The episode has genuine pathos. It takes Brian's need to be seen seriously without making fun of that need. It treats the dignity of a character's desire for validation as something worth protecting. All of this was Brian Griffin in the first few seasons. A flawed person, genuinely flawed, but flawed in ways that revealed rather than obscured his essential decency. Then the show came back in 2005, and things began to change. The change in Brian was slower and subtler than the change in Peter, which is partly why it felt more painful when it became impossible to ignore. Peter's decline was loud. Brian's was quiet. The first shift was the political soapboxing. Brian was always liberal. He was always the character most likely to express the writer's own views about American society, and this was fine in the early seasons because it was just one of many things he was. His politics were a part of his character rather than the whole of it. After the revival, the politics started to take over. More and more screen time was devoted to Brian delivering speeches about whatever issue the writing room wanted to address that week. The speeches were not wrong, necessarily. The positions Brian took were often defensible, sometimes even admirable, but the framing changed. He stopped feeling like a person with opinions and started feeling like a vehicle for the opinions of the people making the show. The distinction matters because it changes how the audience relates to the character. When a character has opinions, you can agree or disagree with them, and the disagreement or agreement is part of your experience of the character. When a character is simply a delivery system for the writer's own views, dressed up in the clothes of a character, the audience starts to feel lectured. Even viewers who agreed with Brian's positions have talked about this in discussions of the show's later seasons, the sense that something performative had replaced something genuine. But the political shift was only the beginning. The deeper decline was in Brian's fundamental character. The generous, witty, flawed, but decent dog of the first 3 seasons became something more troubling as the seasons went on. The failures that had made him sympathetic were replaced by behaviors that were simply cruel. The gap between his self-image as an intellectual and moral person and his actual behavior grew from something comically ironic to something genuinely disturbing. There is an episode in the 9th season called Brian Writes a Bestseller. The premise is that Brian, encouraged by Stewie to get back into writing, produces a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It. The book is not serious literature. It is the kind of motivational text that the early Brian would have held in contempt. But it becomes a massive commercial success, and Brian's response to that success is the episode's horror. He becomes insufferable. He turns on Stewie, the person whose encouragement made the book possible, with contempt and cruelty. He dismisses him. He performs his newfound success with all the graciousness of a person who has spent years feeling overlooked, and now has the platform to make everyone around him feel that way instead. The episode is a portrait of a specific and recognizable human failure, the failure of the person whose resentment of others' success turns, when they finally achieve their own, into contempt for the people they climbed over. But the episode does not present this as a moment of crisis for the character. It does not lead to a reckoning. Brian gets worse, has a public meltdown, and the episode ends without him having learned anything meaningful. The next episode resumes as though it never happened. This became the pattern for Brian in the later seasons. Behavior that was increasingly hard to defend, moments of genuine ugliness, followed by resets that pretended the ugliness had not occurred. A man who treated the woman he was trying to date with manipulative cruelty, a father who abandoned his son without guilt, a friend who repaid kindness with betrayal. The show kept giving Quagmire the role of articulating what the audience was feeling about Brian, most famously in the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, in which Quagmire delivers a speech cataloging Brian's hypocrisy and pretension with the focused anger of someone who has been watching something unfair happen for a very long time and has finally decided to say it out loud. Everything Quagmire says in that speech is true. That is what makes the speech so effective, and what makes the show's failure to act on it so frustrating. The writers knew Brian had gone wrong. They had Quagmire say everything the audience was thinking, and then they continued making Brian worse. The Season 12 episode, Life of Brian, deserves a moment of its own. Brian is hit by a car and killed. The episode is played with genuine seriousness. Stewie is devastated in a way that is deeply felt and beautifully voiced. The family mourns. A new dog named Vinny is introduced. For 2 episodes, the show committed to the reality of Brian's absence, explored what it meant to lose a character who had been there since the very beginning. And then, 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode that same December, Stewie uses a time travel device to go back and save Brian from being hit by the car. Brian comes back. Everything resets. Vinny disappears. The grief that had been genuinely felt is simply reversed. The fan reaction was significant and illuminating. Some people were relieved. Some were furious. Critics and viewers in large numbers read the death and resurrection as a rating stunt, a manipulation of the audience's emotional investment in a character in order to generate attention and viewership. The conclusion that the death was never meant to be permanent, that it was always going to be reversed, that the whole arc was designed to be felt rather than to mean anything, left many people feeling that they had been used by a show that had once treated them with more respect. What Brian's story reveals in the end is something about the difficulty of satirizing a type without becoming it. Brian was designed to expose a particular kind of intellectual vanity, the vanity of the person who aspires to seriousness without achieving it. In the early seasons, this exposure was loving. It was the portrait of a flawed person who deserved better from themselves and who knew it. In the later seasons, the portrait became less loving and more indulgent, less an exposure of vanity and more a performance of it, until the character the show had built to gently mock a certain kind of person became that person, without the gentleness or the mockery. Section 8. Lois, Peter, and the Class War. Nobody talks about. There is a scene that appears in one form or another in dozens of Family Guy episodes, so common that most viewers have stopped noticing it. Peter does something catastrophic. Lois finds out. There is a confrontation. Peter says something that is simultaneously ridiculous and somehow also the thing that, when examined carefully, contains a version of his actual feeling. Lois gets exasperated. At the end of the episode, they are fine. This cycle is the engine of the show. It is the mechanism that drives most of the stories. But it is also, if you look at it from the right angle, a very specific kind of social portrait. It is the portrait of a marriage between 2 people from radically different class backgrounds and the quiet study of everything that difference creates. Lois was born into money. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a billionaire. Old money. The kind that comes with country clubs and the assumption that the world is organized according to the needs and preferences of people like the Pewterschmidts. The family has a yacht. They have multiple properties. They move through the world with the particular ease of people who have never had to seriously consider whether they could afford something. Carter treats everyone who is not from his class with a contempt so complete it borders on aesthetic. He does not dislike people outside his social circle. He simply does not fully register them as real in the same way he registers people who are. Peter is from nothing. He grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, raised by a working-class Irish Catholic family. His father, Francis, who appears in multiple episodes and is played with wonderful sourness, is a devout, humorless man whose relationship with his son consists primarily of mutual disappointment. Peter is not the son Francis wanted, a fact that Francis communicates without particular subtlety. Peter works at a toy factory in the early seasons, and later at a brewery. He drinks beer at a bar called the Drunken Clam with his friends Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland. He is, in almost every visible respect, the exact kind of man that Carter Pewterschmidt would cross the street to avoid. Lois chose this man. The relationship between Lois and Peter is not, in the show's internal logic, a mistake. It is not presented as evidence of poor judgment or low standards. When the show treats it seriously, when it allows the genuine warmth between these two people to surface through the chaos of the weekly premise, it is clear that they actually love each other, that they have built something real over the course of their marriage, that whatever else Peter is, he is also the person Lois chose and continues to choose. The choice carries weight. It says something about who she is. But what the choice has cost her is the show's other secret. Lois gave up a great deal when she married Peter Griffin. She gave up a world of easy privilege. She gave up the assumption of comfort. She is raising 3 children in a medium-sized house in a working-class neighborhood while her father sits in a mansion and her childhood world continues without her. She gave up a version of her future that would have been much more materially secure. And she did it for love, which is the thing that every romantic story celebrates as the correct choice. The show is not entirely comfortable with this. It circles around the question of what Lois lost without ever quite asking it directly. There are episodes in which Lois's old world resurfaces, in which she encounters the life she might have had, and these episodes tend to treat that other life as something vaguely corrupting rather than something genuinely appealing. The wealthy world of the Pewterschmidts is presented as cold, shallow, and ultimately less real than the chaotic warmth of Spooner Street. This is the show's way of resolving the tension. But the tension is real before the resolution. The woman who gave up money for love is also the woman who spends most of her screen time managing the consequences of a man whose behavior regularly creates crises that a more comfortable life would never have produced. Carter Pewterschmidt is the show's most honest villain. In some ways, precisely because his villainy is class-based rather than personal. He does not dislike Peter because of anything particular Peter has done. He dislikes Peter because of what Peter is, because of where Peter comes from. Because Peter is, in Carter's assessment, not the kind of person who should have access to the Pewterschmidt family's daughter and their family's future. The hostility is systematic rather than individual, which makes it both more realistic and more difficult to resolve through the show's usual mechanisms of confrontation and reconciliation. The show's theme song, which every viewer has heard hundreds of times, is a question about values. It seems today that all we see is violence in movies and sex on TV, but where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely? This is Peter asking the question. Peter, who represents precisely the demographic that the nostalgia for good old-fashioned values usually invokes. The working-class man who believes, with complete sincerity and very little supporting evidence, that things were better in some version of the past, that a set of values existed which could have prevented all of the messiness of the present moment if only someone had thought to preserve them. The joke is not at Peter's expense, exactly. The joke is at the idea itself. The show is asking, through Peter's earnest delivery of this question, what those good old-fashioned values actually were, who they served, and whether the nostalgia for them is really a desire for a better world or a desire for a world in which the specific kind of man Peter represents was more comfortable and less challenged. The opening of every episode is a tiny compressed version of the show's central satirical project, delivered so casually and so quickly that most people hear it as background music rather than as an argument. Peter's relationship with his own body is also a more layered thing than the show usually acknowledges. He is overweight, visibly, prominently, in a way that the show makes jokes about constantly. But the weight is not simply a physical characteristic. It is a class marker. Peter eats the way a person eats when food is a primary pleasure because the other pleasures are less accessible. He drinks beer instead of wine, he watches television instead of attending theater. His appetites are working-class appetites, and the show's comedy at his expense is sometimes genuinely funny and sometimes a kind of comfortable mockery of the very people the show claims to be speaking for. MacFarlane was asked in interviews what Peter was really satirizing. He said he wanted to portray a certain kind of American man, the man who says things without filtering them first, the man who has strong opinions and no particular method for evaluating them. But Peter is also a portrait of something more specific than a type. He is the portrait of a man who has internalized a set of ideas about who he is supposed to be and what he is supposed to want, ideas that were handed to him by the culture he grew up in, and who lacks the tools to examine whether those ideas were actually serving him or whether they were serving something else entirely. The show never says this directly. It says it through the recurring pattern of Peter making a decision, the decision going catastrophically wrong, and Peter returning to baseline without having significantly updated his model of the world or his model of himself. The lesson does not stick. The growth does not happen. The character resets. And next week there is a new catastrophe produced by the same fundamental misunderstanding of his own situation. This is either a comedy structure or a tragedy structure, depending on how you hold it. Section 9. The Cutaway Gag and the Death of Death. The cutaway gag is one of the most analyzed and most argued about formal choices in the history of television comedy, and most of those arguments miss the most interesting thing about it. What the cutaway gag actually does, at its best, is violate the grammar of narrative. Story has a grammar, a set of conventions about how events are supposed to follow each other, about causation and consequence, and the movement from one moment to the next. We have internalized this grammar so completely that most of the time we do not experience it consciously. We simply follow the story. The cutaway gag interrupts that grammar without warning. A character says something, and instead of the expected continuation of the scene, instead of the response from the other character or the development of the situation, we are transported to a completely different place in time and set of people. The interruption is total. The original scene does not continue during the cutaway. It waits. It suspends itself while something entirely unrelated happens, and then it resumes as though nothing has occurred. This is a strange thing to do to a story. It is a gesture that says to the audience, the story can wait. The story's internal logic is not the most important thing happening here. There is something else, something that exists in a space adjacent to the story rather than within it, and that something is worth your attention for a moment, regardless of whether it connects to what came before or what comes after. In the early seasons, this worked because the cutaways were genuinely unexpected. They were strange in a way that felt like discovery. A character would make a reference, the screen would shift, and you would find yourself in the middle of a visual gag that was both completely disconnected from the main story and somehow perfectly illuminating about the character who had triggered it. The gag would reveal something, even if what it revealed was only the specific shape of a character's imagination, the particular way someone sees the world. The non-connection was the point. The randomness had meaning precisely because it was so completely random. The early show used cutaways as a kind of counter-melody. The main story was the melody, moving through its beats at its own pace, and the cutaways were a separate line that ran alongside it without needing to harmonize. The effect was a show that operated on multiple registers simultaneously, that could be telling a story about Peter and Lois's marriage, while also making a completely unrelated joke about something that happened in 1974. The multiplicity was the point, but multiplicity requires that both lines be substantial. The counter melody only works if the main melody is strong enough to support the interruption. And as the seasons went on, the main melody began to thin. The plots became less developed. The character moments became less specific. The stories became thinner scaffolding designed to support a collection of cutaways rather than fully realized narratives in their own right. When this happens, the counter melody stops being a counter melody and becomes the whole composition. This is what happened to the cutaway gag over the course of Family Guy's run. It went from being a formal innovation that gave the show a distinctive texture to being the primary delivery mechanism for the show's humor, and in making that transition, it lost something essential. The cutaway works as a violation of narrative grammar only if the narrative grammar is otherwise operating normally. Once the cutaways take over, there is no grammar left to violate. There is a deeper observation to be made about the timing of Family Guy's cutaway dependency, which is that it coincided almost perfectly with the rise of the internet clip culture. The show came back in 2005, the same year YouTube launched. Clips of individual cutaway gags were immediately shareable in a way that clips of a scene with narrative context were not. You could take 30 seconds of a Family Guy cutaway, post it online, and it would be funny to someone who had never seen the episode and had no context for anything around it. The same was not true of a scene between Peter and Lois that derived its emotional weight from the relationship they had built over multiple episodes. The cutaway was internet native. It was designed, whether intentionally or not, for exactly the platform that was about to transform how people consumed media. This created a feedback loop that the show has never fully escaped. The cutaways that worked best on YouTube got more views. More views suggested that more cutaways was the right direction. The writing room responded to the feedback. The show became more and more a generator of individual clips rather than a teller of complete stories. The internet rewarded the clips and showed little particular preference for the coherence of the whole, which meant that the incentive to maintain the coherence of the whole diminished steadily. South Park addressed this directly in 2006 with a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars. The episode depicted Family Guy's cutaway jokes as being generated by manatees randomly pushing idea balls together in a tank, suggesting that the comedy required no craft or intention, that any joke could be swapped for any other joke without any change in effect because nothing was connected to anything else. It was a pointed critique, and it landed with enough force that people on other shows apparently called to express their agreement. Whether or not the manatee critique is entirely fair, the underlying observation is accurate. In the early seasons, Family Guy's cutaways felt specifically chosen. They felt like someone had thought about what specific joke to put in this specific place, at this specific moment in this specific story, to achieve this specific effect. The randomness was curated, which is a paradox that the best comedy often embodies. In the later seasons, the randomness felt genuinely random. The jokes were funny or not funny without having any particular relationship to the context in which they appeared. You could, as South Park suggested, move them around without much changing the overall experience of the episode. The Conway Twitty gag is the apotheosis of this tendency. For those who have not encountered it, the show at various points in its run simply cut to a full, uninterrupted performance of a Conway Twitty song. Not a clip. Not a brief reference. A complete performance that would last for an extended period while the main story waited. There was no joke. The cutaway was the joke, and the joke was that there was no joke. The commitment to producing no comedy was the comedy. This is the kind of thing that is funny exactly once, if you find it funny at all. The first time the show did it, the audacity of the move was startling enough to produce a genuine reaction. By the third and fourth time, it was simply tedious. A placeholder in an episode that had run out of ideas before it reached the runtime. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 contains a moment that is both funny and inadvertently self-condemning. Brian and Stewie travel back to the events of the first episode, and at one point they observe the characters standing around in silence during a cutaway, simply waiting for the interruption to end. The joke is that the characters have nothing to do during these gags. They exist in a kind of suspended animation while the show goes elsewhere, and when the show comes back, they resume as though no time has passed. It is a meta-joke about the format, and it is genuinely clever, but it also describes, with painful accuracy, exactly what was wrong with the show by Season 10. The characters had become placeholders. The story had become a waiting room. The cutaways were the thing, and everything else existed to frame them. The irony is that when Family Guy committed to actual storytelling, when it put the cutaways aside and simply followed its characters through a situation, it was capable of producing some of the most affecting television of its era. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is 22 minutes of two characters trapped in a bank vault, talking to each other. No cutaways. No plot B, no guest stars. Just conversation. Brian tells Stewie that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has thought about using it on himself. Stewie tells Brian what he means to him. The episode is raw and quiet and entirely unlike anything else the show produced before or after, and it is brilliant. The show knew how to do this. It demonstrated that it knew, clearly and unmistakably. And then it went back to the cutaways, because the cutaways were what the internet wanted, and the internet was where the audience lived now, and the audience in its current form wanted clips, not complete stories. Section 10. The show that knew it was a show. Family Guy breaks the fourth wall. It always has, from the earliest episodes, but it does it more and more as the seasons go on, and the nature of the breaks changes in ways that reveal something important about the show's relationship to its own existence. In the early seasons, fourth wall breaks were rare and specific. A character would glance at the camera during an otherwise realistic scene, a moment of complicity with the audience that functioned like an aside in a stage play. Stewie, particularly, would occasionally acknowledge the viewers directly, a natural extension of his theatrical vocal style and his general orientation toward performance. These moments worked because they were unusual. They punctuated the show's otherwise maintained fictional world with a brief jolt of awareness, and then the world resumed. As the seasons accumulated, the fourth wall breaks became more frequent and more elaborate. Characters began commenting on the show itself, on its declining quality, on its extended run, on the paradox of a show that had been going for this long and that everyone involved knew was no longer operating at the level it once had. Peter would look at the camera and make a joke about how many seasons the show had done. Characters would reference specific episodes from earlier seasons with the ironic awareness of people who understood they were living inside a text rather than a world. Some viewers found this self-awareness charming. It felt like the show was in on the joke, like the people making it understood what was happening and were being honest about it rather than pretending everything was fine. There is something appealing about that kind of transparency. But there is a distinction, and it is an important one, between a show that is self-aware about its problems and a show that has solved its problems. Self-awareness does not require action. A character can say, on camera, that the show has been running too long and the writing has gotten lazy, and the show can still be running too long with lazy writing in the very episode in which that character says it. The joke about the problem is not the solution to the problem. It is, sometimes, a way of preemptively defending against criticism by acknowledging it before anyone else can raise it. This is the specific way Family Guy used meta-humor in its later seasons. The show developed a kind of preemptive, ironic distance from its own failures that allowed it to continue having those failures without fully owning them. If the writing was thin, a character could acknowledge that the writing was thin, and the acknowledgement would do some of the work that the actual writing should have done. If the cutaways had gone on too long, the show could make a joke about cutaways going on too long, and the joke would provide a brief flash of genuine cleverness in an episode that was otherwise primarily composed of cutaways going on too long. MacFarlane's relationship with Fox adds another layer to this meta-dimension. The show has always had a complicated attitude toward the network that created it and then canceled it twice, and then brought it back after watching it succeed on someone else's platform. Fox as an institution, Fox News in particular, became a recurring target of the show's political humor, and there is something genuinely strange about a show spending years criticizing the network that broadcasts it while continuing to be broadcast by that network. The show that bites the hand that feeds it, and the hand that keeps feeding. MacFarlane has spoken publicly about his discomfort with the Fox Association. In 2021, he posted on social media that Tucker Carlson's commentary on Fox News made him wish Family Guy was on any other network, comparing his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage. He signed a large deal with NBC Universal in 2020 that moved his production company into the Comcast family of networks. The Orville, his science fiction series, moved to Hulu. The Ted prequel series went to Peacock. His future was being built elsewhere. Family Guy remained on Fox because it was still under contract and because the economics still made sense for everyone involved. But the creator of the show was publicly saying he did not want it there. He was voicing the characters while expressing a desire to be doing something else. The show was continuing because it had, as MacFarlane himself put it, reached escape velocity, a phrase from physics that describes the speed at which an object is moving fast enough to escape a gravitational field. Family Guy had been going long enough and generated enough institutional momentum that it would continue regardless of whether anyone with creative authority was steering it with intention. The show knew it was a show. In the later seasons, it knew it was an old show that had survived longer than most shows survive, that had been canceled and revived and run into the ground and continued anyway, that had accumulated enough cultural weight to justify its own existence indefinitely regardless of quality. It knew it. It put that knowledge in the characters' mouths and played it for laughs. And the laughs were sometimes genuinely funny. But underneath the laughs was the story of a creative endeavor that had outlived the passion that built it, that had become a product when it had once been a vision. The fourth wall breaks in the later seasons are the show talking to itself. They are the internal monologue of a thing that is aware of its own condition and has made peace with it, that has found a way to exist within that condition without too much distress. Whether the audience should also make peace with it is a different question, and one that people watching the show have been answering individually for years, some staying and some leaving and some doing the thing that the internet has made most common, which is continuing to consume the clips while no longer watching the episodes. Section 11: The Meg Griffin Theory. There is a version of Meg Griffin's story that the show never quite told, that it kept approaching and pulling back from, that it set up and then refused to complete. It is the version in which Meg is not a punching bag but a protagonist, in which the thing that makes her the most recognizable character in the show, her complete ordinariness in the middle of complete chaos, is treated as a gift rather than a defect, in which the family that spent years telling her she was unwanted discovers, through some combination of crisis and grace, what they had always had in her. The show did not tell that story. It told a different one. But to understand what was hidden inside the story it did tell, you have to understand what the original design of the character was actually built to do. Meg was the ordinary one in a family of extremes. In the first 3 seasons, this was played with genuine affection. She was a teenage girl navigating the perfectly normal difficulties of being a teenage girl, trying to fit in at school, wanting her family to pay attention to her, experiencing the specific social cruelties of high school, with a resilience that was not dramatized but simply evident. She kept showing up. She kept trying. The family was not kind to her exactly, but the unkindness was mild, the unkindness of benign neglect rather than active hostility. The pivot happened after the show came back in 2005. The jokes about Meg shifted from benign neglect to something more targeted. Her appearance became a source of material in a way it had not been before. Characters began recoiling from her. Her family's indifference hardened into something more actively contemptuous. And the more contemptuous they became, the more the show built its humor around that contempt, the more Meg became defined by her suffering rather than by her character. The reason this happened is not mysterious. The writers discovered that jokes at Meg's expense generated a reliable response from the audience. The character had been established as the lowest status member of the household, and low status is a reliable engine for comedy, which is to say that people tend to laugh at misfortune that they have been conditioned to regard as appropriate. Once an audience accepts that Meg is the person things happen to, the person whose feelings are not meant to count, the person whose protests are themselves the joke, it becomes easy to generate material by simply escalating the things that happen to her. The escalation went very far. By the middle of the show's run, Meg's treatment had moved from the category of mild comic cruelty into something that was genuinely uncomfortable to watch. Peter farting in her face as a form of entertainment. The family casually discussing abandoning her as an infant. Every person in her life, at school, and at home, and in the community, treating her as though her existence were a problem they were tolerating. The message that accumulated over dozens of episodes was that some people simply deserve to be treated this way, that there is a category of person for whom the normal protections of dignity do not apply. The most revealing episode in the entire Meg storyline is Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10. In this episode, Meg confronts her family. She names what has been done to her. She tells Peter he is selfish and irresponsible. She tells Lois she has been a bad mother. She articulates, clearly and in detail, the cumulative damage that years of their behavior has inflicted on her. It is a powerful scene. For the first time in many seasons, Meg is not a punching bag. She is a person. She has agency. She is standing up for herself. And then the episode ends with Meg deciding to take it all back. Not because she was wrong. She was right about everything she said. The episode does not dispute her assessment. The other characters, confronted with her accusations, fall apart. The family dynamics collapse without Meg to absorb the abuse. Peter, Lois, and the others turn on each other when they can no longer unite around the shared project of making Meg miserable. The episode acknowledges that Meg's role in the family is to be the sacrificial target, the person whose suffering keeps the rest of the household stable. And Meg, recognizing this, volunteers to go back to being that person. The message that the episode delivers, however unintentionally, is one of the most troubling in the show's history. Victims of sustained mistreatment, the episode suggests, should accept their role because their suffering serves a function in maintaining the peace around them. Standing up for yourself is presented not as courage but as disruption, as an action that causes problems for the people who have been harming you, and therefore as something you should think carefully about before doing. The correct response to years of abuse is to recognize that you are necessary to the system that abuses you and to return voluntarily to your place in it. Fans responded with fury. The episode is consistently ranked among the most disliked in the entire series, not because it was poorly made, but because of what it chose to say. Even viewers who had never articulated why Meg's treatment bothered them felt the specific wrongness of this conclusion. It was too honest about something that the show should not have been honest about. It named the mechanism that had been powering Meg's storyline for years and then defended that mechanism rather than dismantling it. What makes this even more significant is that the show demonstrated, on multiple occasions, that it knew how to write Meg well. The Simpsons crossover episode, in which Meg meets Lisa Simpson and the two of them become genuine friends, is a beautiful piece of work. Lisa tells Meg she matters. She helps her find a talent she did not know she had. She treats her with the basic dignity that almost no one in Meg's world extends to her. The episode is warm and specific, and it gives Meg something that the show almost never gives her, which is a reason to feel good about who she is. There are several episodes in this vein, scattered through the show's run like islands in a sea of cruelty. Each one proves that the writers understood who Meg could be. Each one demonstrates that the tools for a different Meg storyline were always available, always right there in the room, waiting to be used. The show chose not to use them most of the time, because the other Meg, the suffering Meg, the Meg as punching bag, was easier and produced reliable results. The show did eventually pull back. Around season 14 and into season 15, the worst of the Meg abuse began to diminish. More women joined the writing staff and pushed back against the cruelty. Meg started getting episodes in which she was tough and competent, and occasionally even triumphant. The character who had spent a decade being defined entirely by what was done to her began, gradually, to be defined by what she did. It was not a complete transformation, and it came too late to undo the cumulative effect of the years before it. But it happened. Meg Griffin's story within the show is the clearest proof of what the show was capable of and what it chose not to do. She was always the most human character in a family of archetypes. She was always the closest to the viewer's actual experience. She wanted ordinary things, wanted to be loved and seen and taken seriously, and the show spent a decade punishing her for the ordinariness of those desires before it remembered that there was a reason it had built her that way. Section 12. Where it all went and what it left behind. In April of 2024, Seth MacFarlane gave an interview in which he talked about why Family Guy was still being made. He said he did not see a good reason to stop. He said the show made people happy. He said it helped fund causes he cared about, conservation work, organizations like Rainforest Trust. He said the show had reached what he called escape velocity, a point at which stopping would require a specific reason rather than continuing. He framed the whole thing in terms that were reasonable and honest, and notably absent of any talk about stories he still wanted to tell, characters he still wanted to develop, ideas he still wanted to explore. This is not a criticism of MacFarlane. It is an honest description of what a 25-year-old show looks like from the inside when the person who made it has moved on to other things that matter more to him. He made The Orville, which is a very different kind of show, a serious science fiction drama that required him to engage with the craft of storytelling in ways that Family Guy had long since stopped requiring. He produced the TED television series. He recorded albums. He gave speeches at universities. He is a person with a full and active creative life that extends far beyond the show he made when he was 24 years old. But something was lost when he stepped back from Family Guy, and the loss matters because of what it reveals about how creative works actually sustain themselves over time. The early seasons of Family Guy had a specific quality, a quality that is difficult to name precisely but that is immediately recognizable when you watch them. They feel like they were made by someone who knew what they were doing and why. Every joke, even the absurdist ones, especially the absurdist ones, felt placed with intention. The characters felt like people the writers had thought about carefully, not just in terms of their comedic function, but in terms of their inner lives and their relationships and the specific ways they were unlike anyone else on television. That quality came from MacFarlane's presence in the room. He had built these characters from real people and real observations and real ideas about American life, and his proximity to the material kept the show honest about what it was doing and why. When he left the writing room in 2010, the show continued with talented and experienced writers who knew the characters and knew the world. But they did not have his specific relationship to the original material. They did not have the 25 years of accumulated attention that he had been paying to the specific types of people the show had been built to portray. The result was a show that continued to produce Family Guy, but that gradually lost the sense of what Family Guy was for. The humor got louder to compensate for the loss of precision. The shock value increased because shock is easier to generate than the kind of carefully constructed discomfort that the early show had produced. The characters drifted from their original designs because nobody was holding the compass that pointed toward who they were supposed to be. This is the secret that Family Guy was hiding. Not a scandal. Not a controversy. Something quieter and more important. The show was built on a vision that was specific and personal and grounded in real observations about real people and real social dynamics. It was built by a person who cared deeply about what he was making and why. And over time, as the show became a product, as it became a brand, as it became an institution, that original vision was gradually replaced by the accumulated inertia of a long-running show that had found a formula and was executing that formula with decreasing intentionality. The original vision is still visible in the early seasons, if you know what you are looking for. It is in the way the characters were built on real people. It is in the way the theme song announces the show's satirical project in the first 5 seconds of every episode. It is in the specific social portrait of the Peter Schmidt wealth, rubbing up against Peter's working-class identity. It is in Brian's failed novel and his specific kind of educated self-delusion. It is in Stewie's British accent in an American household, and what that accent was built to say about dependency and liberation and the psychic labor of being young in a world you did not choose. The show told its secret in every episode, in the texture of the choices it made, in the characters it built, and the relationships it put them in. Most people who watched it in those early years responded to The Secret without knowing exactly what they were responding to. They knew something was there. They knew the show was doing something more than filling time with shock value and pop culture references. They did not always have the language for what the something was. And then the show went on for 20 more seasons, and The Secret got buried under 20 years of cutaway gags and declining ratings, and a creator who had moved on to other projects, and a writing staff that was doing its best with a machine that had been running long enough to develop its own momentum, independent of anyone's vision for it. The golden years remain golden. The first 3 seasons are still brilliant, still specific, still doing the thing that gave them their life. The early revival seasons have moments that reach back toward that original vision, episodes that remember what the show was for and produce something worthy of it. The best episodes of the entire run, the ones that people still talk about, the ones that surface in every serious discussion of the show's history, are the episodes in which the original intentions of the characters were honored rather than eroded. The family at the center of it all was always the real subject, not the cutaway gags, not the shock value, not the celebrity cameos or the Star Wars parodies or the shocking death that was reversed 2 episodes later. The Griffins were the subject. A working-class man who did not think before he spoke, a woman who had given up money for love, a baby who was furious about being a baby, a dog who had convinced himself he was better than his situation, a teenage girl who just wanted to be seen, and the world they built together, however imperfectly, however chaotically, however far from the good old-fashioned values on which they used to rely. That family was built on real people, on a security guard who wore glasses and had no filter, on the men MacFarlane's father knew, big and loud and New England Irish and completely themselves. On MacFarlane's own relationship with creativity and failure, and the persistent, slightly ridiculous desire to be taken seriously as an artist. On every observation about class and ambition and family and the specific texture of American domestic life that he had accumulated over the first 24 years of his existence and poured into a 15-minute demo for $50,000 and then watched become something that 22 million people saw on Super Bowl Sunday in 1999. That is what Family Guy was hiding. The person who made it. The things he believed about the world. The portrait he was trying to paint, with every silly joke and every cutaway gag serving as a kind of misdirection, so that the portrait could be there for the people who wanted to find it without demanding that anyone look. The show existed, at its best, as a secret that you could watch every week without ever discovering, or as a story that revealed itself the moment you started paying close attention. The Griffin family in their house on Spooner Street, arguing and loving each other and failing and trying again, was always the whole thing. Everything else was just the dress they put on it. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with me. Drop a like on the video if you enjoyed it. And if you found something in here that surprised you or changed the way you think about the show, share it with someone else who might find it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now so you don't miss whatever comes next. Sleep well. Be kind to the Meg Griffins in your life. See you in the next one. Section 13. The writing room and the alchemy of early seasons. Every room produces something different. The chemistry between people in a creative environment is one of those things that is almost impossible to replicate once it is lost, almost impossible to manufacture on purpose, and almost impossible to fully explain even when you are inside it. The best rooms in the history of television comedy have produced work that transcended what any individual in that room could have made alone, and the worst rooms have taken brilliant individual talents and produced something that did not deserve any of them. The writing room for Family Guy's first 3 seasons was the product of specific circumstances that aligned in a way that probably could not have been planned. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old and running his own show, which meant that the natural conservatism of a more experienced showrunner, the tendency toward caution and the avoidance of risk that comes with having a lot to lose, was simply not present. He was making bold choices because he had not yet accumulated enough institutional experience to be afraid of them. He was working with a group of writers who had been assembled to help build something new, not to maintain something established, which is a fundamentally different creative posture. The writers who shaped those early seasons included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker, among others. These were not people who had spent 20 years learning to write network television by the numbers. They were people who were still figuring out, in real time, what the show was capable of, what the characters could do, how far the humor could be pushed before it stopped being funny and started being something else. That uncertainty was productive. It meant that every episode was still a discovery rather than an execution. Janetti, who would later develop a successful career as a showrunner on his own projects, has spoken about the energy of that early room. There was a quality of genuine surprise to the work, a sense that nobody quite knew yet what the rules were, which meant that the rules could be broken without anyone having to consciously decide to break them because nobody had fully written them down yet. The best comedy often comes from that place, from the moment before the formula is established, from the exploratory period when the creators are still asking what kind of show this is rather than executing what kind of show this has become. MacFarlane himself was deeply involved at every level. He was voicing 4 of the main characters while simultaneously overseeing the writing, the animation direction, the music choices, and the overall creative vision. He was everywhere in the production in the way that a creator who genuinely cannot afford to delegate is everywhere, not because he was a micromanager, but because the show was an extension of his specific imagination, and no one else could fully see it the way he could. When you are the one who had the original vision, you are also the one who can tell when a joke is precisely right for this character at this moment in this story, and when it is close but not quite. That judgment is not transferable. It lives in the person who built the original. The music of the early seasons is another element that carried the show's hidden intelligence. Walter Murphy and Ron Jones, the composers who scored the original run, brought a sophistication to the show's musical landscape that most animated comedies never approached. The use of big band jazz and Broadway-style orchestration as backdrop for a cartoon about a Rhode Island family was a deliberate choice that reflected MacFarlane's own musical obsessions. He loves the music of the 1940s and 1950s. the Frank Sinatra era, the Hollywood musical tradition. Putting that music under the chaos of the Griffin household created a tonal contrast that was funny in its own right. The absurdity of genuine swinging jazz accompanying Peter's latest catastrophe, and that also elevated the material in a way that pure comedy scoring would not have. Jones was fired by Fox at some point during the revival period, a decision that MacFarlane has spoken about with evident frustration. The music changed after that. It became more generic, more functional, less distinctive. One of the unspoken sources of the original show's character disappeared quietly from the background, and most viewers never consciously noticed it was gone. But they felt the absence in the way you feel the difference between a room with good acoustics and one without. The voice cast contributed things that cannot be found in any script. Alex Borstein's Lois was built on a voice she had been using in a stage show in Los Angeles before MacFarlane heard it and hired her. The network tried to replace her after the pilot. She fought to keep the role. Fox actually required her to re-audition against every available actress, and she won. Borstein brings to Lois a specific quality of barely contained exasperation that is absolutely essential to the character. Lois functions as the show's moral center not because she is always right, but because she is always trying, always working to hold something together that keeps threatening to come apart, and Borstein plays that effort in every scene with a precision that lesser casting would never have achieved. Seth Green's Chris is built on one of the strangest audition choices in television history, the voice of Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, specifically as imagined coming out of the mouth of an 11-year-old. Green and his friend, Charlie Korsmo, came up with this approach as a kind of dare before Green's audition, and it somehow worked, producing a voice that is both recognizable and deeply weird, a quality that suits a character who operates largely in a state of benign bewilderment. Mila Kunis was 16 years old when she auditioned for Meg, and there are documented accounts of her lying about her age to get the job. She claimed to be 18. She has said in interviews that she figured she would be 18 by the time she actually needed to be. The show hired her. She has voiced Meg ever since, which means she has spent most of her adult life lending her voice to a character who the show spent over a decade systematically degrading. In interviews, she has talked about strangers approaching her and repeating the dismissive catchphrase that became associated with Peter's treatment of Meg, saying it directly to her face as though the real woman behind the character were also fair game for the joke. The fictional cruelty bled into reality in a way that nobody had planned for, and that raises uncomfortable questions about what we are actually doing when we make certain kinds of humor normal. The early show's relationship with its own medium was also part of its hidden intelligence. Family Guy was, from its first episodes, in conversation with the history of animation in a way that most of its competitors were not. MacFarlane's education at the Rhode Island School of Design had given him a foundation in the craft of animation that went beyond simply knowing how to draw cartoons. He understood the history, understood what different animation styles communicated about tone and character, understood why the loose expressiveness of early Hanna-Barbera cartoons felt different from the precise mechanicism of Disney features or the underground rawness of Ralph Bakshi's work. The early episodes referenced not just contemporary pop culture but the deep history of American animation, the Hollywood Golden Age, the radio dramas of the 1930s and 1940s, the theatrical traditions of vaudeville and burlesque. MacFarlane has talked about being fascinated by those older forms of entertainment since he was a child, about the specific pleasures of a kind of storytelling that has been almost entirely lost, that relied on voice and language and the listener's imagination rather than on the visual spectacle that came to dominate all entertainment in the second half of the 20th century. The first 4 episode titles of Family Guy's first season are Death Has a Shadow, I Never Met the Dead Man, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, and Mind Over Murder. The word death appears in 3 of the 4. This was not accidental. MacFarlane was drawn to the aesthetic of suspenseful radio dramas from the 1930s and 1940s, shows that used the vocabulary of death and danger as an atmospheric backdrop for even fairly mundane stories, and the early episode titles carry that influence. As the show became more confident in its own comedic identity, this tendency faded, but it left a trace of something in the show's early DNA, a quality of darkness lurking at the edges of the comedy that would occasionally surface in episodes that reached for something deeper than the standard animated family sitcom was willing to go. All of this, The music and the voice choices and the animation history and the radio drama influence and the specific configuration of people in the writing room added up to a show that had more going on than it was ever required to acknowledge. The show worked on the surface as a comedy. It worked at a second level as a satire of specific American social dynamics. And at a third level, mostly invisible to anyone who was not paying very close attention, it was a personal work, a self-portrait made by a young man who had spent his entire childhood training himself to make something like this, and who had finally been given the opportunity and the budget to do it. Section 14. The Neighbors and What They Reveal. No character on Family Guy exists in isolation, and the characters who surround the Griffins on Spooner Street are as carefully constructed as the family itself, even if the show does not always honor that construction with the consistency it deserves. Glenn Quagmire is the character that the show uses most consistently to externalize things that the main characters cannot say directly. In the early seasons, he functions as a kind of comic id, a character whose relationship with women is treated with the show's characteristically amoral eye as an expression of something true about a certain kind of man, rather than simply as a source of shock value. The giggity catchphrase became one of the show's most famous exports, but the character beneath the catchphrase was, in the original seasons, more complicated than the catchphrase suggests. Quagmire was a retired Navy flight lieutenant. He had a background that gave him a specific kind of competence and confidence, a man who had done something genuinely difficult and who carried the ease of that accomplishment into everything else he did. His womanizing was presented not as pathetic or desperate, but as a performance of abundance, as the behavior of someone who had decided early in life that the normal constraints did not apply to him and who had, to his own considerable surprise, been largely proven right. The episode Jerome is the New Black is significant not because of what Quagmire says about Brian, though that speech is among the most effective things the show ever produced, but because of what it reveals about Quagmire's complexity. He is a character with strongly held moral positions, which coexist without apparent irony with a personal life that would not withstand serious moral examination. He hates Brian because Brian is a hypocrite, because Brian claims a moral and intellectual superiority that his behavior does not support. But Quagmire is also a hypocrite, in different and perhaps less self-aware ways. The difference is that Quagmire does not claim to be better than he is. He presents himself accurately, or at least without the pretension of seriousness that Brian maintains. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem. The show has a strong opinion about hypocrisy, about the specific kind of dishonesty that comes from claiming one set of values while acting from a completely different set. Brian is the show's primary vehicle for examining this kind of hypocrisy, the hypocrisy of the intellectual class, of people whose self-image as thoughtful and progressive and sophisticated is regularly contradicted by their actual behavior. But the show also notices the quieter honesty of Quagmire, who makes no claims about being good and is therefore not a hypocrite even when he is doing something bad. Joe Swanson's arc across the show's seasons is a miniature version of the show's larger decline, and it is worth examining closely because it illustrates something important about how decay happens in a long-running show. Joe was introduced in the first season as the cool neighbor. He was a police officer who used a wheelchair, and the joke in his introductory episode was that everyone in the neighborhood found him impressive despite the disability, or perhaps partly because of it. He had overcome something. He was tough and capable and confident. Peter was actually jealous of how much people liked Joe. Over the seasons, Joe's dignity was gradually eroded. His disability, which in the early episodes was simply one characteristic among many, became increasingly a source of comedy in ways that were less thoughtful than the original treatment. His marriage to Bonnie fell apart. He was mocked more and treated with less respect by the same people who had once admired him. The character who had been introduced as someone whose achievement was worth respecting became a figure of pathos and then of mockery. This happened not because of a conscious decision to diminish Joe, but because of the accumulated effect of a writing room that was always looking for new angles, and that eventually discovered that playing against the original, characterization was an available source of material. The most consistent change across the show's long run is this kind of erosion, the gradual loss of the original dignity that each character was given, and the replacement of that dignity with something more easily exploitable. Joe was cool, then he was sad. then he was funny in a way that depended on his sadness. The trajectory describes something about how we tend to treat people who remind us of loss and limitation. Cleveland Brown departed the show at the end of season 8 to anchor his own series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. His absence removed something from the main ensemble that was never quite replaced. Cleveland was the most grounded of the group at the bar, the one whose humor came from bemused acceptance of the world's absurdity rather than from active participation in it. He had a dryness and a warmth that counterbalanced Quagmire's wildness and Joe's earnestness. When he left, the dynamic at the Drunken Clam changed in ways that the show accommodated without exactly solving. The bar itself is worth a moment. The Drunken Clam is the show's version of the tavern at the center of every classic American comedy about working-class men, from The Bar in Cheers to the corner bar in every city neighborhood comedy from the 1970s. It is the place where the social world of a certain kind of American man is organized, where friendships are maintained and problems are discussed and the week is processed. Peter's investment in the bar, the seriousness with which he treats his time there with his friends, is one of the most humanizing things about him in the early seasons. The bar is not simply a place where he drinks. It is the social institution that gives his world structure. In the later seasons, the bar's function changes. It becomes more of a location than an institution, a place where characters happen to be rather than a place that means something. The ritual of the four friends gathering there loses its warmth as the friendships themselves become less warm, as Peter treats his friends more carelessly and the show treats the bar more casually. The shift is subtle enough that you might not notice it in any specific episode, but if you watch the early seasons and then jump to the later ones, the bar feels different. It has lost the quality of being necessary. The neighborhood of Spooner Street is in many ways the show's most carefully constructed background detail. It is a neighborhood that could exist in any working-class suburb of any medium-sized northeastern American city, which is to say it is simultaneously specific to a particular geography and completely recognizable to anyone who grew up in or near a community like it. The houses are close together, people know their neighbors. The local institutions, the church, the school, the bar, the brewery where Peter works, are the organizing structures of a world that is not cosmopolitan and not rural but something in between, something that has its own textures and codes and ways of understanding itself. This is the world that McFarlane grew up adjacent to, the world he was observing when he was writing that comic strip at age 9 and thinking about the things that made people laugh and squirm at the same time. The show placed those observations inside a familiar form, the animated family sitcom, and used that form's familiarity as cover for everything it was doing beneath the surface. Section 15. The Golden Age of Animation and Where Family Guy Fit. To understand what Family Guy meant when it arrived in 1999, you have to understand the specific moment in television history in which it arrived, because the show did not appear in a vacuum. It appeared at a particular point in the development of animation as a medium for adult storytelling, and its arrival both reflected and accelerated something that was already happening in the culture. The Simpsons had premiered in December of 1989, almost exactly a decade before Family Guy, and its success had demonstrated for the first time that an animated series could be a genuine cultural event for adult viewers, that the cartoon did not need to be designed primarily for children, that animation was a format capable of the same range and sophistication as any live-action drama or comedy. The decade between The Simpsons and Family Guy had produced other experiments in this space. Beavis and Butthead, which premiered in 1993, pushed into the territory of deliberately stupid humor aimed at specifically adolescent sensibilities. South Park, which premiered in 1997, used crude animation and extreme content as the delivery system for political and social satire that was sometimes genuinely brilliant and sometimes simply extreme for its own sake. King of the Hill, which premiered in 1997 on the same network as Family Guy 2 years later, offered a warmer, more grounded version of the animated family comedy, a show about genuine decency in a specific regional community rather than about the exaggeration of dysfunction. Family Guy came into this landscape as something different from all of them. It was not as carefully crafted as The Simpsons at its best. It was not as deliberately provocative as South Park. It was not as warmly humanistic as King of the Hill. It occupied a space between these poles that had not quite been occupied before, combining the dysfunctional family structure of The Simpsons with a surrealist comedy sensibility that had no direct precedent, a willingness to violate its own narrative logic in pursuit of a joke that was specifically its own, even when it seemed to be borrowed from other sources. The comparison with The Simpsons was immediately made, and has been made continuously ever since. The two shows share a surface structure: the working-class father, the put-upon wife, the collection of children who each represent a type, the talking pet who functions as a voice of reason. The comparison is not entirely unfair. MacFarlane grew up loving The Simpsons. He has said it was the show that changed his sense of what was possible in animation. The DNA of The Simpsons is visible in Family Guy in the way that the DNA of influences is always visible in the work of people who were genuinely changed by them. But Family Guy was not trying to be The Simpsons. Its humor operated on different principles, was interested in different things, produced different effects. The Simpsons at its peak was concerned with the texture of ordinary American life, with the way real human beings navigate the gap between their aspirations and their realities. It had genuine pathos. It cared deeply about its characters and their inner lives. Family Guy cared about those things too, but it also cared about something that The Simpsons was much more careful about, which was the experience of watching television itself. Family Guy is deeply aware of television as a medium, as a context, as a cultural institution that shapes the way people understand themselves and each other. Its cutaway gags are not simply jokes about random things. They are jokes that exist inside a reference to something that was on television, or something that works like something that was on television, or something that parodies the conventions of television in a way that only makes sense if you have been watching television for most of your life. The show was built for people who had been marinated in American popular media from childhood, who could process a reference to an obscure 1970s sitcom in real time without needing any context, who found the specific pleasure of recognition, the pleasure of getting it worth something in its own right. This is one of the reasons the show connected so powerfully with its Adult Swim audience. The people watching at 2 in the morning on Cartoon Network were exactly the demographic that had grown up in front of the television, that had absorbed decades of American popular culture as a kind of second language, that found Family Guy's dense intertextuality not exhausting but exhilarating. Every reference rewarded the viewer who caught it and functioned as a kind of tribal identifier, a way of marking the audience as the specific kind of person this show was made for. The internet amplified this effect enormously. When YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from its cancellation, it created a new infrastructure for the specific kind of humor that Family Guy specialized in. A 30-second cutaway gag could be clipped, uploaded, and shared with millions of people who could respond to the joke without needing any context for the episode it came from. This made Family Guy into something that no television show had ever quite been before, a show whose best moments existed most powerfully outside the show itself, in the circulation of clips that generated conversation and laughter and cultural currency independent of any particular episode or storyline. The show was born at exactly the right moment to become the first truly internet-native animated comedy. It was revived at exactly the right moment to exploit the new infrastructure that the internet was building for viral video content. Whether this was strategic on anyone's part, or simply the result of a remarkable coincidence of timing, is difficult to say, but the effect was real and significant. Family Guy became part of the language of internet humor in a way that even The Simpsons, for all its cultural dominance, never quite managed. The Simpsons is quoted, "Family Guy is clipped and shared and turned into the raw material for memes that circulate continuously in online culture." This viral dimension changed the show's relationship to its own history in ways that were not entirely healthy. The clips that circulated most widely were not necessarily the clips from the show's best episodes. They were the clips that worked best as isolated moments, the most self-contained jokes, the most instantly legible references, the most extreme content. The show's legacy in internet culture skewed toward its most surface-level qualities, which created an environment in which the writing room was incentivized to produce content that worked as clips rather than content that worked as episodes. The early seasons, which had been designed with the episode as the primary unit, gradually gave way to a show designed with the clip as the primary unit, and the difference is profound. An episode requires characters and story and context and the patient building of something that pays off over 22 minutes. A clip requires none of that. A clip requires one genuinely funny moment that can exist in 30 seconds without any of the surrounding architecture. Once a show starts writing toward clips rather than episodes, it has made a choice about what kind of thing it wants to be. Family Guy made that choice gradually, without any single episode or season in which the decision was explicit, through the accumulated effect of a million small choices in a writing room that was always responding to what the internet was doing with the work. Section 16. What the world lost when the show changed. There is a specific thing that the early seasons of Family Guy understood about American working-class life that is very difficult to find anywhere else in television. It is the understanding that this life is not simply a series of pratfalls and bad decisions, not simply the setup for jokes about ignorance and excess. It is a life that has its own logic, its own forms of intelligence, its own sources of genuine satisfaction and genuine sadness. And the comedy that comes from it is most powerful when it comes from inside the logic rather than from outside it looking in. Peter Griffin in the first 3 seasons is funny from the inside. The jokes about him work because the show understands him well enough to find the specific version of his behavior that is true to who he is, that reveals something about the specific shape of his worldview, that makes you laugh while also making you recognize something real. He is not simply a big, loud, dumb man. He is a big, loud, impulsive man who has absorbed a set of ideas about what his life is supposed to look like, and who pursues those ideas with a sincerity that is both touching and catastrophic. The comedy is not at his expense in any simple way. It is in the gap between what he is trying to do and what he actually manages, and that gap is recognizable to anyone who has ever watched someone they care about work very hard towards something and completely miss the point of what they were working toward. This is what was lost when the show turned Peter into a vehicle for cruelty. The specific intelligence of the original characterization gave way to a simpler, more brutal comedy in which Peter was simply a bad person doing bad things, and the audience was supposed to find that funny without the warm recognition that had made the earlier version work. The new Peter was not recognizable. He was not true to any real version of the type he had originally been built to represent. He was a grotesque that had lost its connection to the human original. The same loss applies to each of the main characters. Brian's early characterization as the aspirational failure, the person who reached for seriousness and landed somewhere short of it, was true in a way that was both funny and compassionate. The later Brian, who was simply an unpleasant person with pretensions, was funny only in the most mechanical way, producing laughs from the recognition of a type without any of the warmth that made the recognition feel like something other than condescension. Stewie's transformation is perhaps the most philosophically interesting, because what was lost was not simply a character but an idea. The evil genius baby was, in its original conception, doing something that almost no character in television had done before. It was asking what the inner life of an infant actually looks like, was imagining that experience from the inside with enough specificity and intelligence to produce genuine comedy from it. That is a serious undertaking dressed in a ridiculous costume. The costume is what made it accessible. The serious undertaking underneath was what made it last. When the writers decided that the evil baby premise had been exhausted, they were making a judgment about their own relationship to the material rather than a judgment about the material itself. The premise was not exhausted. It had barely been begun. The specific idea that infancy is experienced as captivity, that the dependent relationship with a parent contains genuine fury as well as genuine love, that the helplessness of early childhood is a psychic condition that leaves marks regardless of how gently it is handled, these are ideas that could have sustained years more of exploration without becoming stale. The writers became tired of the premise before the premise became tired of them, and the result was the retirement of one of the most original characters in the history of animated television. What replaced it was good. The friendship between Stewie and Brian produced moments that the evil baby version could never have produced, moments of genuine emotional depth and mutual recognition. But replacing something original with something good is a loss even when the replacement is genuinely good, because the original was both good and irreplaceable, and the replacement is good but replaceable. The loss that is hardest to quantify, the loss that takes the longest to see, is the loss of the show's relationship to real people. The original characters were built on observations of real human beings living real lives in a real place. They had the specificity and the occasional inconsistency of things drawn from life. As the show ran further from its origins, the characters became increasingly distant from those real human reference and increasingly shaped by the logic of the show itself, by what had worked in previous episodes, by the formulas that had accumulated into what the show simply did. This is the normal trajectory of a long-running show. The characters gradually cease to be versions of real people and become versions of themselves, shaped more by their own fictional history than by anything in the world outside the screen. The Griffins of Season 20 are not related to any real people in the way the Griffins of Season 1 were. They are related to the Griffins of Season 10, who were related to the Griffins of Season 5, and the distance from the original human sources grows with each generation of reference. This is not a reason to condemn the later seasons or to pretend they have nothing to offer. Long-running shows develop their own internal realities that can be genuinely interesting in their own right, even when those internal realities have become unmoored from the world outside. But it is a reason to understand why the early seasons feel different, why watching them produces a different kind of recognition, why the laughter they generate tends to carry a slightly different weight. The early show was in conversation with the real world. The later show was in conversation with itself. Section 17: The Legacy. Honestly held. Here is what is simply true about Family Guy. It changed television. Not in the way that The Simpsons changed television, not in the way that a show that dominates its era for a decade changes it. It changed television in a more specific and perhaps more durable way by proving that there was an audience for animated comedy that operated outside the Simpsons model, that the specific sensibility MacFarlane had developed, the cutaway structure, the pop culture density, the willingness to go to genuinely uncomfortable places in the pursuit of a laugh, could sustain a show over a long period and generate a loyal audience of enormous size. It also proved something about audiences that the television industry had not fully understood before. The cancellation and revival story is not simply an interesting anecdote from the show's history. It is a demonstration that audiences are not passive recipients of whatever the network decides to put in front of them, that they have preferences and loyalties that persist even through cancellation and hiatus, that the right show for the right audience will find its way to that audience through whatever distribution channels become available, regardless of what the network chooses to do or not do. Family Guy built one of the most passionate cult followings in television history during the period when it should have been dead. The people who found it on Adult Swim at midnight were not simply watching a cartoon. They were claiming something. They were saying that this thing, which the network had decided was not worth keeping, was worth their time and their attention and their money. The DVD sales that brought the show back were not just commercial transactions. They were votes, expressed in the most tangible possible way, for the continued existence of something that the industry had written off. That passion has never entirely disappeared. The people who found the show in its early years, who grew up watching it, who carried its jokes and references into their friendships and their daily lives, are still there. They are the people who continue to debate whether the show was ever really good, who argue about which seasons are worth watching, who hold the memory of what the show was at its best against what it became in its later years, and feel the distance between those two things as a genuine loss. The show produced some of television's most analyzed moments. Stewie's voice and his particular brand of theatrical menace generated more cultural conversation than almost any animated character in the post-Simpsons era. Brian's death and resurrection remains one of the most talked-about stunts in animated television history, not because it was well executed, but because the audience's response to it, the genuine grief and then the genuine fury when it was reversed, demonstrated just how deeply these characters had embedded themselves in the lives of the people watching them. You do not grieve the death of a fictional dog unless that dog has meant something real to you. The intensity of the response to Brian's death was, in its own strange way, a testament to how well the early show had built him. The show also produced a model that countless other animated comedies have attempted to replicate, with varying degrees of success. The cutaway gag format, in particular, has been borrowed and adapted and sometimes simply stolen by shows that wanted to achieve something like what Family Guy had achieved. Almost none of them have managed it, which is evidence that the format alone is not the thing. The early show's cutaways worked because they were made by specific people with a specific sensibility, People who had a particular understanding of what was funny and why, and how to get from the setup to the punchline in exactly the right number of steps. Strip away the specific sensibility, and you are left with a formal choice that, on its own, does nothing. The city of Quahog, Rhode Island, the fictional setting built in the image of the real cities and towns that McFarlane had observed during his time at RISD, has become one of American animation's most recognizable fictional locations. It exists in a very specific way that distinguishes it from Springfield, which is the deliberately prototypical American town of The Simpsons, existing everywhere and nowhere, stripped of regional specificity so that it can represent the universal. Quahog is specifically a northeastern working-class city, with the particular textures and rhythms of that kind of place, and that specificity is part of why the show resonates differently from its great animated predecessor. The show renewed for 4 more seasons in April of 2025. In a deal with parent company Disney, the renewal takes the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. 15 episodes per season. The machine continues turning. The economics continue to make sense. The brand has enough residual value, enough institutional momentum, enough licensing and streaming and merchandise revenue to justify continued production regardless of what the creative output actually represents at this point in the show's history. McFarlane has said he does not see a reason to stop. He has framed the show's continuation in terms of its external usefulness, the money it generates for conservation causes, the happiness it brings to people who still watch it, the institution it has become. These are all real things. They are not nothing. But they are also not the reasons the show was worth making in the first place, not the reasons a person should make an animated comedy, not the reasons that produce the kind of work that the early seasons were. And yet the early seasons remain. They are there. They are available. You can watch them tonight, or early tomorrow morning, or right now if you choose to. You can watch the first episode, with its 22 million inherited viewers and its security guard voice and its evil baby and its talking dog with the failed novel, and you can see what it was before it became whatever it eventually became. The original is still there. The thing McFarlane made in that apartment, on that $50,000 budget, when he was 24 years old and had not yet learned to be afraid of anything, is still there. That is the consolation, if consolation is what you need. The secret story that Family Guy was hiding is also the secret story that any genuinely good creative work is hiding, which is that it was made by a specific person with a specific history and specific observations and specific loves, and that the person who made it poured something of themselves into it that is still there in every scene of the early seasons, still visible, still recognizable, still saying the things it was always saying to anyone willing to listen. The Griffins live on Spooner Street. The dog has a martini. The baby is building something. Peter is about to do something that he should have thought through more carefully. Lois is trying to hold everything together. Meg is just trying to be seen. The show was always about them. The secret was always them. Sleep well. Section 18. The specific genius of early Stewie and what we forfeited. It is worth dwelling longer on what we forfeited when the evil Stewie was retired, because the loss is larger than it usually gets credited for, and the way it happened tells us something about a very common failure mode in long-running creative work. In the first season of Family Guy, Stewie Griffin attempted to kill his mother in nearly every episode. He built weapons in his bedroom. He launched missiles at the house. He developed mind control devices and weather alteration machines and robots, and a dozen other instruments of destruction, all aimed at one target. He would sit in his high chair, spooning strained peas into his mouth with the resigned expression of someone who has much more important things to do, and occasionally he would set aside the spoon and contemplate the logistics of his next scheme with the focused attention of a general planning a campaign. Then Lois would pick him up and hug him and coo at him, and the gap between what she thought was happening and what was actually happening was so enormous that it contained its own entire comedy, a comedy built on dramatic irony that never wore out because the irony was structural rather than situational. The thing about dramatic irony is that it produces a specific kind of pleasure that is different from the pleasure of a surprise. A surprise happens once and is gone. Dramatic irony is renewable. You can know that Stewie wants to kill Lois and still find it funny the 100th time you see her pick him up and call him her little butterball, because the gap between her perception and your knowledge never closes. The pleasure is not in being surprised, but in being on the inside of something, in knowing what the innocent character does not know, in watching the scene unfold with that knowledge always available to color everything that happens. MacFarlane has said in multiple places that he and the writers felt the evil baby premise had been taken as far as it could go. He said this most directly in the years after the shift had already been made, looking back at the decision as though it were obviously correct. But the evidence of what they did with Stewie after the shift is instructive. The show ran for well over a decade more with the softer, friendlier Stewie and produced fine episodes throughout that period. The Road to Adventures with Brian continued to be among the show's most popular output. The emotional depth that Stewie's friendship with Brian made available produced some of the show's most affecting moments. But the show produced none of these later seasons' worth of material with the original Stewie. The original version was used for 6 seasons before being retired. The replacement version has now been running for twice as long. If the writers genuinely believe the original premise was exhausted after 6 seasons, how do they account for the fact that they have been working with the replacement for 12? The logic that says the evil baby joke had run its course would, by any consistent application, also say that the sensitive, emotionally available Stewie has run his course several times over. What actually happened is simpler and more honest than the exhaustion narrative. The writers got tired of working within the constraints of the original premise. The evil baby required a specific kind of writing, a writing that had to stay true to the character's internal logic, that had to find new and interesting angles on a premise that was deliberately narrow. Narrow premises require more creativity to sustain, not less, because you cannot simply throw new characters or new situations at them. You have to keep returning to the same basic territory and finding something fresh within it. The writers ran out of the specific kind of creative energy that the original Stewie demanded, and rather than pushing through that exhaustion, they changed the character. This is not a moral failure. It is a completely understandable professional decision made by people working under significant time pressure on a demanding schedule. But understanding it does not make the loss smaller. It just makes the loss explicable. There is one episode that demonstrates with almost cruel clarity what the original Stewie was capable of and what the show walked away from. In Send in Stewie Please, which aired in the show's 16th season, Stewie is sent to a child psychiatrist after concerns about his behavior. He and the psychiatrist have a long, almost completely uninterrupted conversation in which Stewie first maintains his new, softer public persona and then gradually, under the pressure of the session, reveals something of the original character underneath. He acknowledges, in the episode, that he still thinks about taking over the world. He admits that he still talks to his therapist about his old goals, even though they have become more theoretical than operational. The episode is remarkable for its restraint and its honesty about what the show had given up. It is the show looking back at its own past and saying, through Stewie's admission, that the original version of this character is not gone, that it is still there, that it has simply been suppressed. And then the psychiatrist is allowed to die at the end of the episode, not by Stewie's hand directly, but through Stewie's deliberate inaction, because he feared the psychiatrist had seen too much. The episode is both a farewell and a partial return, a reminder of who Stewie was and a demonstration that the writers could still access that version when they chose to, which makes the rarity of those episodes, the relative absence of the original Stewie in a show that has been running for decades, feel less like an inevitability and more like a choice. The choice had consequences. The show without the original Stewie is a show that is missing its most irreplaceable element, not its most popular element, necessarily. The Road to Adventures have been enormously popular, and many viewers who discovered the show after the revival have little attachment to the evil baby and find the Stewie-Brian friendship more engaging. But there is a difference between popular and irreplaceable. Many things are popular that are not irreplaceable. The evil baby was irreplaceable, and the show has not quite filled the specific space he occupied in over 15 years of trying. Section 19. How sound shaped the show's soul. Animation is a visual medium, but Family Guy was shaped as much by sound as by anything you could see on the screen, and this aspect of the show's construction goes almost entirely unexamined in most discussions of it. Seth MacFarlane is a serious musician. This is not a secondary detail or a curiosity. His love of the musical traditions of the 1940s and 1950s, the swing era, the Hollywood musical, the big band orchestration that was the dominant popular music of his parents' and grandparents' generations, runs through every aspect of the show's audio identity. He has released multiple full albums in that style, has performed at Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall and the Hollywood Bowl, has engaged with this music as a practitioner and not merely as an appreciator. The music on Family Guy reflects this engagement. Ron Jones, who scored the original seasons and several of the revival seasons, brought a genuine compositional sophistication to the show's music that was entirely at odds with the conventional approach to animated comedy scoring. Where most animated comedies use music functionally, as punctuation for jokes and transitions and emotional beats, Jones used it expressively, in ways that added layers of meaning to scenes rather than simply marking their rhythms. The early show would sometimes place a genuinely beautiful piece of big band orchestration under a scene involving Peter doing something catastrophically stupid, and the contrast between the sophistication of the music and the stupidity of the action created a kind of comic resonance that was unlike anything in animated comedy. The songs that Peter performs in various episodes, from his a cappella barbershop quartet imitations to his full musical numbers, reflect MacFarlane's genuine musical facility. The Shipu Upi number from the episode Patriot Games, in which Peter leads a full musical production number in the middle of a professional football game, is absurd on its face, but is also a genuinely accomplished piece of musical comedy, arranged and performed with a care for the material that elevates it above the merely silly. It is funny because it is ridiculous in context, but it is also funny because it is good, because the musical craftsmanship involved is real, and the audience can sense it even if they cannot articulate it. The show's theme song, composed by Walter Murphy, who also scored the original seasons, is one of the most accomplished television theme songs of its era. It is not simply a melody attached to some appropriate words. It is a fully realized piece in the style of the 1950s television family comedy, complete with the lush orchestration and the slightly satirical brightness of that era's musical language, and it holds up as a piece of music independently of its function as a theme song. The irony of using the warmest, most wholesome possible musical tradition to introduce a family comedy whose content is anything but wholesome is one of the show's most consistent jokes, one that the audience hears every single episode without necessarily registering it as a joke. Jones was removed from the show during the revival period under circumstances that MacFarlane has found frustrating. The specific reasons for the change have never been fully explained publicly, but the result was a scoring style that became less distinctive over the seasons, more functional and less expressive, less in conversation with the specific musical traditions that MacFarlane cared about. The later seasons sound different from the early ones, and not only in the superficial sense that the music reflects different compositional choices, they sound like a show that is less invested in what its own music is doing, more willing to let the score be background rather than foregrounded intention. The voices are the show's most consistent audio signature, and they remain among the most recognizable in American animation. MacFarlane's four main voices, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, are so distinct from each other and so internally consistent that it is easy to forget they are all produced by the same person. The craft involved in maintaining four fully realized vocal characters simultaneously, each with its own rhythm and pitch and emotional register, is genuinely impressive. And MacFarlane's vocal performance is one of the things that has remained constant across all of the show's transformations, a through line of technical consistency in a work whose other elements have changed significantly. Alex Borstein's Lois is similarly remarkable for its consistency and its range. The voice is fundamentally a slightly heightened version of a specific New York, Long Island accent, the voice that Borstein had first developed in her stage work before MacFarlane heard it and knew immediately it was the voice of Lois. What Borstein does with that voice across over 400 episodes is a masterclass in the specific art of voice acting, finding within a relatively constrained vocal palette an enormous range of emotional expression. From the resigned exasperation that is Lois's default mode, to the genuine warmth that surfaces when the show allows her to care about something without irony. The show's use of music as joke delivery is one of its most underappreciated qualities. The moment in which a familiar song appears, either in its original form or in a clearly referenced style, and the specific way that the song interacts with the image it accompanies, is responsible for some of the show's funniest moments. These jokes work only if you know the song, which means they are exclusive in a way that the more visual humor is not, and the exclusivity is part of what makes them rewarding. Being the person in the room who catches the musical reference first is a small pleasure, but it is genuine, and the early show manufactured those pleasures with a consistency that reflects a room full of people who cared about music in the specific way that MacFarlane cared about it. Section 20. The philosophy underneath the comedy. Family Guy has always been, on its most theoretical level, a show about consequences, or more precisely, a show about the refusal of consequences. In the real world, actions have lasting results. Decisions compound over time. The things you do today become part of the context in which you make decisions tomorrow. The person you are at 40 has been shaped by every choice made since childhood, and those choices cannot be unmade by the following week. This is true of all real human lives, and it is part of what makes real human lives feel weighty and meaningful and sometimes terrifying. Family Guy's world operates according to different rules. The reset button is the show's most fundamental structural convention, more fundamental even than the cutaway gag. At the end of each episode, whatever has happened returns to baseline. The characters are back where they started. The consequences of the episode's events do not carry forward into the next week. The world is clean again. The slate is blank. This convention is standard for animated comedies of this type. The Simpsons operates the same way. Most sitcoms operate the same way. The episodic reset is what makes a show manageable to produce over hundreds of episodes. If every decision had permanent consequences, the show would eventually box itself into a corner from which no amount of creative effort could extract it. The reset is a practical necessity as much as it is a philosophical choice. But Family Guy's version of the reset is more aggressive than most shows, and the aggression reveals something. The show does not merely reset its characters' relationships and situations. It periodically resets the characters themselves. Episodes that build toward a genuine character moment, towards something that should mark a turning point in who a person is, are routinely followed by episodes that proceed as though the turning point never occurred. Peter learns something and unlearns it by next week. Meg is finally treated with dignity and is back to being mistreated before the month is out. Brian reveals something true about himself, and then the revelation has no consequences for how he behaves going forward. This is the consequence problem. A show that refuses consequences is a show that cannot commit to meaning. Meaning in narrative comes from consequences. When something happens and nothing follows from it, the event is retrospectively revealed to have meant nothing. It was a performance of meaning rather than meaning itself. The audience is invited to feel something during the episode and is then told, by the show's behavior the following week, that there was nothing actually to feel, that the emotion was a temporary state rather than a response to something real. The show's best moments, the moments that fans cite most consistently across decades of discussion, are almost all moments that the show then retreated from. Meg's confrontation with her family in Seahorse Seashell Party, Brian's revelation about the gun in the bank vault, Stewie's grief when Brian dies, Peter's occasional recognition of what he has done to his family. These are genuine, they are well made, and they are consistently undermined by the episodes that follow them, episodes that pretend the genuine moment never occurred. This pattern says something about the difference between a show that is willing to be about something and a show that is willing to visit the territory of being about something without committing to the address. The early Family Guy in its best episodes was about something. It was about the specific social textures of working-class American life. It was about the gap between aspiration and reality. It was about what happens when families love each other badly. The later Family Guy visits all of these territories, sometimes with genuine skill, but rarely with the commitment that would make the visits amount to anything. The philosophy underneath the comedy, the thing that makes comedy meaningful rather than merely entertaining, is the acknowledgement that actions have consequences, that choices reveal character, that the things we do to each other leave marks. Family Guy knew this once. The early seasons were structured around it. Peter did something, suffered for it, learned something, and the learning was real even if it was expressed in silly terms and resolved in a comedic key. The later seasons lost this structure, not dramatically or suddenly, but gradually, through the accumulated effect of too many resets and not enough follow-through. The show became less about what happened to these people and more about what could happen to these people in the service of a joke, which is a subtle but significant difference. The joke stopped being something the story was built toward and started being the whole point, the thing the story existed to deliver. And yet the first 3 seasons remain extraordinary. And yet the best moments of the revival seasons, the moments that still get cited and celebrated and watched obsessively by people who love the show, are genuinely extraordinary. And yet the entire strange history of this show, from the $50,000 pilot to the Disney mega deal, from the cancellation to the Adult Swim resurrection to the season renewals into the decade of the 2020s, is itself a kind of extraordinary story. The secret Family Guy was hiding was always the same secret that good art hides, which is that it was made by a person who cared about something, and that caring is visible in the work if you know how to look for it, and that the work is better for the caring even when the caring was imperfect, even when the vision was only partially realized, even when the people in the room did not always have the tools to fully execute what they were trying to do. The show that Seth MacFarlane built in that apartment in 1998 on $50,000 and a lifetime of accumulated observation still lives inside every episode of every season, even the ones that failed it. It is there in the voice of the security guard from the Rhode Island School of Design, who never knew he was becoming Peter Griffin. It is there in the frustration of the infant who refused to simply be a baby. It is there in the dog who could not quite finish the novel and could not quite give up on it either. The Griffins are still on Spooner Street. The light is still on. They are probably arguing about something. They always were. Section 21, the show that kept going and the people who stayed. There is a specific kind of loyalty that long-running shows produce in their audiences, a loyalty that is not entirely rational and that the shows themselves do not always deserve. People who have been watching a show since childhood develop a relationship with it that goes beyond evaluation of quality, beyond the reasonable question of whether the show is still doing what a show should do. The relationship becomes biographical. The show is woven into the fabric of years. It is tied to specific memories, specific friendships, specific periods of life. Letting go of it means letting go of something that feels personal. Family Guy has one of the most fiercely loyal audiences in the history of animated television, and that loyalty has survived the show's worst seasons, its most egregious decisions, its most obvious failures of craft and character. People who began watching the show when it premiered in 1999, who watched it find its audience on Adult Swim in 2003, who watched it come back in 2005 and spent the revival years defending it against critics who said it was already declining, have continued watching it through seasons that gave them very little reason to continue watching. This loyalty is not simply stubbornness. It is the recognition that the thing they loved in the early seasons is still there in the later ones, sometimes. It surfaces unpredictably, in an episode that suddenly remembers what the characters were originally built to do, in a joke that has the specific texture of early show intelligence, in a moment between two characters that briefly has the warmth the show sustained so easily when it was young. These moments are less frequent than they used to be, but they exist, and their existence is enough to sustain people who are already invested enough to keep showing up. The show returned to Adult Swim in January 2025, more than 20 years after the block's reruns had first built the cult that saved the show from cancellation. The symmetry is almost too neat to be entirely real. The show that Adult Swim rescued comes home. The network that took a chance on a dead cartoon gets its investment returned, decades later, in the form of a brand that has become large enough to generate its own gravitational field. The late-night cable viewers who stayed up watching reruns in 2003 are now in their 40s, and their children are watching the show on Hulu. The generational transmission of Family Guy is one of the stranger aspects of its continued existence. The show that was designed for a specific late 1990s version of an adult audience, a show that assumed a particular relationship to 1970s and 1980s pop culture, has been discovered by viewers who have no direct memory of the references it makes. These younger viewers encounter the show without the context that the original audience had, and their relationship to it is correspondingly different. They like different things about it. They find different episodes funny. They have a different sense of which characters work and which do not. This is not a bad thing. Artworks that survive across generations do so precisely because they contain something that can be accessed from multiple angles, something that speaks to different people in different ways depending on when they arrive. The show that means one thing to someone who discovered it at midnight on Adult Swim in 2003 means something different to someone who found it on Hulu in 2020. Both relationships are real. Both are legitimate. The show is large enough to contain both. What the younger audience's relationship to the show often lacks is the context that allows the earlier seasons to be fully appreciated. The specific brilliance of the first 3 seasons, the way the characters were built on real observations of real social dynamics, the way the cutaway gags worked as a countermelody to a fully realized narrative, the way the humor had layers that revealed themselves on repeated viewing. This is difficult to appreciate if you arrived at the show through the later seasons, where the layers are fewer and the surfaces more dominant. The later show taught audiences to expect certain things, and those expectations shape how the earlier material is received when people go back to it. The ideal experience of Family Guy, the experience that lets you see everything the show was doing, is to watch the first 3 seasons without preconception, to meet the characters before the show itself has told you what they are, to encounter the Griffin family in the period when the writers were still discovering them and allowing them to be complicated. That experience is still available. The episodes are all still there. But it requires a willingness to sit with a show that looks and sounds different from what the internet has conditioned us to expect from it. A willingness to let a story develop over time rather than skipping to the moments that function best as standalone clips. The show that MacFarlane built and the show that the institution has been maintaining are 2 different things that happen to share a name and a setting and a cast of characters. This is not unusual. Long-running shows almost always eventually become institutions, and institutions produce institutional output, work that is shaped more by the requirements of continuation than by the original creative impulse that made continuation worth pursuing in the first place. The miracle is not that the institution eventually lost the quality of the original work. The miracle is that the original work was as good as it was. That a 24-year-old making a 15-minute demo for $50,000 produced something that would still be generating cultural conversation 30 years later. The secret that Family Guy was hiding was also the secret that MacFarlane himself was hiding, in the specific way that creators hide the real content of their work inside its surface content. He was a young man from Connecticut who had spent his entire childhood training himself to make something, who had made the thing, who had watched it nearly die several times, who had survived his own near death on a September morning in a way that he chose not to mythologize, but that clearly left its mark. He was a person who cared enormously about the music and the writing and the specific texture of the comedy he was making, who took the work seriously in ways that the show's surface absurdity was designed to conceal. That care is still visible if you look for it. It is in every episode of the early seasons. It is in the specific way Stewie was voiced, the care with which the Rex Harrison influence was adapted and maintained. It is in the way Brian's novel was handled, with genuine respect for the specific kind of failure it represented. It is in the relationship between Peter and Lois, which was always a real marriage between 2 people who genuinely loved each other across an enormous and rarely acknowledged class divide. The Griffins were always real people. They came from real people. The show knew it. The writers knew it. The person who built it knew it better than anyone. The show was always telling you the truth about them, if you were listening. The light is still on at Spooner Street. It has been on for 25 years. Whatever you think about the show it became, the show it was at the beginning was something worth finding. Go find it. Section 22. The Final Accounting. Every show eventually becomes its own legacy. It ceases to be primarily what it is and becomes primarily what it was, what it meant at its peak, what the most devoted members of its audience carry around in their memories as the ideal version that subsequent seasons are measured against. Family Guy reached that point some years ago, and the conversation about the show now is almost always implicitly a conversation about 2 shows at once, the one that is still running and the one that used to exist, and the relationship between them. The ratings tell part of this story. The show that debuted to 22 million viewers in 1999 now averages fewer than 1 million new viewers per episode on the nights it airs. That is a reduction to less than 5% of the original audience, a decline so steep that it would have ended most shows long ago. The show continues because its economics are not primarily dependent on its first-run viewership. It continues because of streaming, because of reruns, because of merchandise, because of the enormous catalog of episodes that generates licensing revenue without requiring anyone to produce new content. It continues because the brand has outgrown the show and can sustain the show indefinitely. Fox moved Family Guy from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, the first time it had aired on a weekday since its original troubled run. In the television industry, this kind of scheduling move carries meaning. Sunday nights in prime time are where networks put their most valuable properties. Wednesday nights are where they put things they want to continue airing but no longer believe are their strongest offerings. The move was a public reclassification of Family Guy from flagship to solid performer, from the thing that anchors the night to one more show in the rotation. The show responded to the scheduling change by continuing to exist, which is what shows do. MacFarlane, in his April 2024 interview, said something that functions almost as an accidental epitaph for the show's creative ambitions. He said the show had reached escape velocity, meaning it had been going long enough that it would continue under its own momentum regardless of any individual decision to stop. He described it as something that no longer needed his specific input to keep moving. This is not a critical assessment, not an expression of disappointment. It is simply an honest description of what happens to things that have been running for a quarter century. Escape velocity. The object has been moving long enough and fast enough that the original force that launched it is no longer required. The gravity that was pulling it down, the gravity of cancellation and quality evaluation and creative judgment, has been overcome. The object moves on. This is one way to understand what Family Guy became. The other way is to understand what it was before it reached escape velocity, in the years when gravity still applied. When the creative decisions being made in the writing room still mattered for whether the show would survive, and for whether what survived would be worth watching, those years produced something. Those years, specifically the first 3 seasons and the best moments of the revival era, produced something that has earned a place in the conversation about what American television was capable of at a specific moment in its history. The secret story Family Guy was hiding is the story of how it was made and why. The story of a man who built characters from real people and real observations and carried those characters into a room and made them live on a screen for 25 years, even when the making was imperfect, even when the room had changed and the original vision had blurred and the institution had replaced the passion that built the institution. The characters are still there. The early seasons are still there. The things they were trying to say are still there. What MacFarlane made in that apartment in 1998 was something that the person who made it cared about, and the caring is still visible in the work, in the specific texture of the jokes, in the way the characters were drawn from life, in the way the show's music carried the weight of a lifetime's love of a particular tradition, in the way a 1-year-old baby spoke like a Bond villain and said something true about what it feels like to be completely dependent on someone while being completely aware of that dependency. The show hid its seriousness inside its comedy. It hid its observations inside its jokes. It hid its heart inside its chaos. That is the secret. That is the whole thing. Sleep well. The Griffins are still on Spooner Street. The dog still has a martini. The baby is still building something in his bedroom that nobody in the house knows about. Peter is still about to do something catastrophic. Lois is still trying to hold everything together with a patience that is itself a kind of love, though not always a kind either she or Peter can name. The light on the porch is still on. It has been on for 25 years. Whatever you think about everything that happened after the beginning, whatever you think about who the characters became and what the show turned into, and whether the legacy is mostly triumph or mostly loss, the light was on at the beginning, and it was warm, and it meant something. Go back to the beginning sometime. Watch a few episodes from the first 3 seasons. Let them surprise you if they haven't, and let them remind you if they have. There is something in there that was worth making and worth finding, and it is still there, waiting. That is the end of the story. That is where everything was hidden all along. In the making of it. In the care. In the specific, stubborn, impossible belief that a joke can mean something if the person telling it cared about it enough. Wherever you are watching this, whatever time it is there, thank you for spending this time with me. And if you found something in this story that surprised you, that reframed something you thought you already knew about this show, drop it in the comments. The conversation is part of why this is worth doing. Every person who watched Family Guy at midnight on Adult Swim in 2003 has a version of this story that is a little different from everyone else's. And those versions are worth sharing. Like the video if you enjoyed the journey. Subscribe if you want to come on the next one. The door is always open and there is always more to discover. Sleep well wherever you are.